Few wrestlers in this generation will go down as being more influential than Cody Rhodes. Yes, this is a man who is truly self-made, with him starting his career in WWE, all before leaving the company, going on a vision quest, and then returning to become the #1 wrestler in the world today. But how did it all happen? Well, join us as we take a deep dive into the entire tale right now. The opening line of his theme song says it all: wrestling has more than one royal family. That's right, while the McMahons take a seat at the head of the table, outside of maybe the Hart or Anoa'i clans, there is perhaps no family more celebrated or important in wrestling than the Rhodes. Cody Garrett Runnels was born into this lineage on June 30th, 1985, back when his father Virgil Runnels, more commonly known as Dusty Rhodes, was by that point already a multiple-time NWA World Heavyweight Champion. As a child then, Cody grew up knowing he was part of a dynasty. Hell, by the time he started amateur wrestling in high school, his older brother Dustin was already making waves in WCW. So in response to this, the younger sibling decided to follow in his family's footsteps into the world of pro wrestling too. Of course, he wasn't entering this new environment blind though. No, he had in fact been learning the fundamentals from his father from the age of 12 years old, and had even done some work as a referee while in high school. Who trained him? Well, that would be Al Snow. And this level of training, combined with his family name, meant it wasn't long before he got signed by WWE's developmental system, Ohio Valley Wrestling. Yes, it was in May of 2006 that Cody got his start, quickly teaming up with Shawn Spears to win the company's tag team championships. And after that, the rookie even had a brief OVW heavyweight title run, all before he and Spears started feuding with each other over the television championship. Ultimately, though, this program ended in June of 2007 when both men would go to a no contest inside of a steel cage, marking the son of a plumber's last appearance with the promotion. What was the reason for this? Well, WWE had big things planned for him and had drafted him over to the big leagues. So it was then that on July 2nd, 2007, Cody made his debut on Raw, appearing in a backstage segment with Randy Orton and his father Dusty, beginning a feud between Orton and the young Rhodes. After that, well, Cody got into a series of short-term programs with the likes of Daivari, Charlie Haas, and Shelton Benjamin. Sure, it was clear to see at the time that he was still young and green, but the potential was there for him to be great, and WWE recognized this, with them giving him his first real push on December 10th, 2007 when, alongside Hardcore Holly, he became a World Tag Team Champion after defeating the team of Lance Cade and Trevor Murdoch. But Holly wouldn't be his partner for long. No, soon Ted DiBiase Jr., who himself was a second-generation star and son of the legendary $1 Million Man, began feuding with the new tag team champions. And this led to a match at the June 29, 2008 Night of Champions pay-per-view, where the title holders were supposed to be taking on the team of DiBiase and a mystery partner. Unfortunately for Holly, however, this mystery partner turned out to be Cody himself, as he turned on his teammate and joined forces with Ted, becoming tag team champions with him instead in the process. Yes, things were moving up for the grandson of a plumber and his new partner, and while they would lose those titles by the end of the year, the young duo would soon be on the upswing again when they aligned themselves with Randy Orton to form the stable Legacy. What was the gimmick of this team? Well, it was that each man was a second, or in Orton's case, third-generation superstar. And with Randy already being a former WWE champion by this point, it was hoped that by putting him alongside the two young up-and-comers, his star power would rub off on them. Interestingly, though, it's since been suggested that WWE pegged Ted DiBiase Jr. to be the breakout star of the group, something which obviously didn't happen. That's right, while Cody has gone on to far bigger things, DiBiase has since retired from wrestling altogether. Back then, though, both men were riding the wave, with Cody making it all the way to the final three of the 2009 Royal Rumble. And after that, both he and DiBiase got involved in that year's WrestleMania main event feud when they helped their stablemate Orton wage war against Triple H. Of course, this was the young Rhodes' first real taste of the main event scene then, and he took full advantage of it, often shining in six-man tag matches during this period, with one of the most memorable of these being the Legacy's winning effort against the team of Triple H, Batista, and Shane McMahon at that year's Backlash pay-per-view, where, due to a stipulation, Cody was even able to help Orton regain the WWE title. And as if that wasn't enough, Rhodes and DiBiase would also feud with the newly reformed D-Generation X at this time, with the two young talents getting a major spotlight by having a tag team match with Triple H and Shawn Michaels at the 2009 SummerSlam. In fact, so good were things going for them here, they even got a win over the iconic stable a month later at Breaking Point, all before finishing out the trilogy at Hell in a Cell. So with their newly risen stock at a peak then, it was about time for the team to branch off on singles runs, as happens with all units in WWE eventually. And that would come about when dissension reared its ugly head and the stablemates started having issues beginning at the 2010 Royal Rumble. This led to a triple threat match between the three members of the Legacy taking place at WrestleMania 26, and though Rhodes and DiBiase would still be aligned for a while afterwards, such a match represented the real end of the group. The only question left then was what would the future WWE champion do once he and Ted DiBiase finally parted ways too? Well, after being moved to SmackDown in the 2010 draft, Rhodes took advantage of a poll which had been taken on who the most attractive male and female wrestlers were. Yes, he ended up being voted the best-looking man here, and so used this to morph into Dashing Cody Rhodes, a narcissistic character who would go as far as to offer grooming tips to fans, all while also becoming extremely protective of his face during matches. Unfortunately for him then, during a match with Rey Mysterio on January 21st, 2011, Cody suffered a legitimately broken nose. However, seeing this as an opportunity to further his character, he began wearing a face mask here, telling the world that he had required extensive facial reconstructive surgery as a result of the incident, and so was no longer to be referred to as dashing, but instead undashing. Obviously then there was a clear Phantom of the Opera vibe to this, and it was very entertaining to watch Cody develop in terms of promo and character work as a result of it. Hell, at one point he even began handing out paper bags to audience members and demanding that they wear them as their ugliness and imperfections offended him personally. And as if that wasn't enough, he would also put paper bags over the faces of opponents after beating them. Of course, it was all made intentionally hilarious by the fact that the mask Rhodes wore was clear plastic, so you could see his face the whole time and tell that he looked pretty much the same as he always had. So much fun would this gimmick be, in fact, Cody has since said that it represented his second best work as a pro wrestler, and it's hard to argue with this. Needless to say then, he'd be on a roll as the summer came around, with all this leading to the August 12th, 2011 edition of SmackDown, where he achieved a lifelong ambition of becoming Intercontinental Champion after pinning Ezekiel Jackson. Yes, while its luster had faded by that point, the Intercontinental title was known in years prior as being the workhorse belt within WWE, often held by the best wrestlers of their day such as Macho Man Randy Savage or Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. And as Cody had grown up idolizing those very performers, getting a chance to hold that same belt himself almost meant more to him than winning the WWE title would have. So big of a moment was this for him, in fact, he even went as far as to successfully lobby the company to bring back the classic 1980s white strap design of the title, something which delighted many old school fans at the time. Where would he go now that he was champ? Well, Cody once again found himself in a program with Randy Orton, although this time he was far closer to Orton in terms of position on the card than he had been before, so it was less of a master-student situation and more of a beef between two equals. And as evidence of this, the Rhodes son even managed to get a win over his former mentor on the September 12th edition of Raw. From there, the title reign continued as Cody dropped the mask and took on all comers, including the likes of John Morrison and Booker T, all before losing the belt to the Big Show at WrestleMania 27, ending things at an impressive 233 days. But that wouldn't be the end of his time in the spotlight. No, his next notable program after this would see him team up with Damien Sandow in September 2012 to form the Rhodes Scholars, with the two early on vowing to win the tag team titles. Despite numerous attempts, however, they were never able to capture the gold, and so it was that in early 2013 they mutually agreed to dissolve the team but remain best friends, giving audiences a rare amicable tag team split. Of course, later that year, a feud eventually developed between the two after Sandow cost Rhodes the Money in the Bank contract so he could win it for himself. And this led to Cody's first babyface turn since 2008 during a series of matches where the highlight was probably Rhodes throwing his former teammate's Money in the Bank contract into the Gulf of Mexico. Yes, while he had hoped to be a main event force permanently come 2013, Cody was still stuck in an upper mid-card role. Despite this, however, he would soon reach his creative peak in WWE up until that point when a story began with him getting kayfabe fired from the company after standing up to Triple H and the Authority. Of course, this firing served more than just a storyline purpose, though. Yes, it also gave Rhodes time to go on his honeymoon with backstage interviewer Brandy. The pair had been dating for some time by that point, you see, and had gotten married in September 2013. So being away from the ring for a while gave them both a chance to enjoy being newlyweds before being thrown back into the chaos of the wrestling world. And all the while that he was away, the story continued on screen when Cody's brother Dustin and father Dusty got involved in an attempt to get him reinstated. In the end, however, after Dusty was attacked by the Big Show, his children decided that they'd had enough of waiting and gate-crashed Raw, taking out the Authority's attack dogs The Shield in the process. This then led to a match at the 2013 Battleground pay-per-view where the Rhodes brothers were able to defeat Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins and win their jobs back in one of the most emotionally satisfying moments in wrestling history. That said, they would eventually lose those belts at the Royal Rumble in January 2014, and after the loss, Cody began losing confidence in his abilities, with this leading to him deciding it was time to leave the team, going away to rediscover himself in the form of Stardust. Who was Stardust? Well, he was a gimmick clearly designed as a play on his older sibling's Goldust character, all while also being a reference to his father's private jet's name back in the 80s. So, with the union between the brothers strong again now that Stardust was here, the pair would re-team in the summer of 2014 and on August 18th win the tag team titles once more after beating the Usos. Needless to say then, all was well for a while after this. In fact, even when they lost the belts at that year's Survivor Series pay-per-view, the two brothers remained on the same page. That would change, however, when Cody turned heel on Dustin on the February 16, 2016 edition of Raw. And this was the big moment for them because, behind the scenes, the two had plans for a major feud they hoped would be able to blow off at that year's WrestleMania. Sadly, though, Vince McMahon didn't see the potential in this and instead decided to have the match between them take place the month before at Fastlane. As you can imagine then, Cody was disappointed with this and began to realize that he was not going to be booked as the star he believed he could be at this time. And times would continue to get even tougher for Cody as it was on June 11th, 2015 that his father Dusty Rhodes would pass away. From here then, the Stardust character would morph into something more resembling a comic book villain who, at one point, even got into a feud with Arrow star Stephen Amell. Yes, the American Nightmare had hit another ceiling, something which was evident in the fact that after this program was over, he'd mill around in the mid-card, forming the Cosmic Wasteland with the Ascension and losing to the likes of Apollo Crews and Zack Ryder on TV. So in hindsight, it really shouldn't have come as a surprise that on May 21st, 2016, Rhodes announced that both he and his wife Brandi had asked for his release from the company, something which would be granted the following day. Why was he leaving specifically? Well, as expected, Cody would cite frustrations with his position on the card as his main reason for leaving. So now going by the moniker of the American Nightmare, a play on his father's American Dream nickname, he quickly started working on the indie circuit, something he had never gotten a chance to do before now. And here, the young Rhodes proved his motto, do the work, was more than just empty words, as he filled up his diary with every date he could take, wrestling the likes of Zack Sabre Jr. and Chris Hero in Evolve, and taking on performers like Eddie Edwards and Mike Bennett in TNA, all while also becoming a regular member of the Ring of Honor and New Japan rosters. And it was here that he'd first meet the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega, with him quickly being invited into their inner circle as he joined the Bullet Club. This particular corner of the Bullet Club was, of course, by now something of a splinter group, though, referring to themselves as the Elite. And the Elite, whose numbers also included the likes of Hangman Adam Page, were becoming something of an online sensation thanks to their YouTube series, Being the Elite. And it was also around this time that Cody helped to put out the first ever All-In event, something which served as a precursor to AEW. That's right, it was on September 1st of 2018 that the show went ahead, with Cody becoming the first second-generation NWA champion in history by beating Nick Aldis. And while he didn't go on last that night, Cody was clearly the main event to both the live audience and those watching at home, showing just how big of a star he could be. And it was also here that Cody and the Young Bucks met Tony Khan, with them helping to create All Elite Wrestling, a new wrestling promotion that was officially announced on January 1st of 2019. But they wouldn't just be roster members here. No, at the initial press conference, Cody revealed that he, alongside the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega, would act as executive vice presidents for the company, as well as on-air talent. So, with everything now set up and ready to go, on May 25th, 2019 at Double or Nothing, the inaugural AEW event, Cody finally got a chance to have the match he'd wanted to have with his brother Dustin all those years ago, with this one being an instant classic, proving just how great the American Nightmare could be. Obviously then, given his status as the company's top babyface, once AEW's weekly TV show Dynamite began airing soon thereafter, Cody found himself the #1 contender to the world title, a title held at the time by Chris Jericho. And the stipulation to this match was that if Cody should lose, he would never be able to challenge for the title again. Of course, most fans expected him to win the gold here then, given the stipulation at play, but in a twist, he ended up losing after being screwed over by his kayfabe best friend MJF. So they would go on to feud after that in a program which peaked with a segment where, in exchange for agreeing to a match, MJF demanded Cody take 10 lashes across the back. When it was all over, then you wanted nothing more than to see Cody get his revenge. In another twist in the story, though, he didn't. No, MJF ended up beating Cody in their long-awaited match at Revolution on February 29th, 2020. That's right, it seemed that while arguably still the biggest babyface in the company, Cody was insistent on making sure he didn't dominate the main event scene and wanted to ensure that other, younger talents got put over too. Not that Cody would get nothing in terms of wins, however. No, he got his first singles title when he became the company's inaugural TNT champion at May 23rd's Double or Nothing pay-per-view after winning an 8-man tournament that ended in a match between him and Lance Archer. And from there, Cody, keen to use this title victory to build new stars, started a weekly open challenge where anyone could compete for the belt, whether they were a member of the AEW roster or not. But none of them would be able to beat the champ. No, that wouldn't happen until August of 2020 when Cody had to leave AEW for a few weeks so as to film a part in a TV show. So before going, he put over Brody Lee as strong as could be done, having him absolutely destroy Rhodes and win the belt in just over 3 minutes, looking like a monster in the process. That said, Cody would return on September 23rd to get his revenge, beating Brody in a dog collar match to once again become the champion, with this being the bout which also ended up serving as the Dark Order leader's swan song before he tragically passed away just a few months later. As to where Cody would go after this, well, this was where things started to fall apart for him in AEW as, now being iced out of the world title picture, as well as rumors of backstage friction between him and the rest of the Elite, leading to him no longer being affiliated with that group on screen. And at the start of 2020, in a move which shocked everyone, both Cody and Brandi would announce that they had not been able to come to terms for a new contract with AEW, and that, as a result, they would be leaving with immediate effect. That's right, it was a truly unforeseen moment, and one that remains a point of discussion to this day, as the exact circumstances surrounding Cody's exit from AEW have never been made public. The only question now was where his next landing spot would be, and that landing spot would be a return to WWE. It all happened at WrestleMania 38. That was when, after the weeks leading up to the show had seen Seth Rollins be told by Vince McMahon that he was going to have a mystery opponent at the Showcase of the Immortals, the Architect headed down to the ring during the middle of the show. And as he awaited the arrival of a man he'd be facing, the lights went out and the familiar sounds of Downstate began blaring out of the loudspeakers in the arena, signaling that Cody had returned. But this wasn't the previous WWE version of Cody. No, this was his own presentation through and through, complete with the same theme music he had used over the past few years. And now Rhodes was, like his father before him, able to use his momentum as someone who'd achieved outside of the WWE to roll right in and start a win streak. A win streak which began with him defeating Rollins a total of 3 times over the course of the spring. That said, it would also be during this period that Cody hit a bump in the road, as after tearing his pec off the bone during a workout session in early June of 2022, the American Nightmare would be forced to work his final match against Seth, a Hell in a Cell match, with one of the nastiest looking injuries ever seen on screen. And that meant that even if Cody would have to take the rest of the year off following it in order to get surgery and heal up, he'd remain hugely over, as no one could forget about the insanity of seeing his bruised up body fight it out inside of a cage for 25 full minutes. So when he finally returned at the Royal Rumble in January of 2023 then, fans everywhere were ready for him to win the whole thing and become the company's new top babyface star. And those fans would not be disappointed as it turned out, because after entering at number 30, Cody would book his ticket to WrestleMania. Who would he be challenging here? Why, Roman Reigns, of course. That's right, this was right in the midst of the Tribal Chief's 1,316-day-long run as undisputed WWE Universal Champion. And as the Showcase of the Immortals neared, it became clear there were now 2 options to finally dethrone the champ and end the Bloodline saga: Cody or Sami Zayn. So when Sami failed at Elimination Chamber in February, everyone assumed Rhodes was going to win at Mania, but in another moment that shocked us all, he wouldn't. No, that match would end up with him coming out on the losing end too, looking dejected in the middle of the ring as Roman Reigns continued on with his reign of dominance. Yes, from this point, we'd see Cody have to work his way back up from the bottom again. And this was why, as the spring turned into summer, he'd find himself recovering by doing things like winning a feud with Brock Lesnar, briefly becoming undisputed WWE Tag Team Champion alongside enemy-turned-friend Jey Uso, and then winning the Royal Rumble for the second year in a row on January 7th, 2024. All that was left then was for him to challenge Roman again at WrestleMania 40 and this time beat him, something fans eagerly anticipated as the WWE began to enjoy the biggest wave of success it had undergone in decades. That said, there would be a spanner thrown in the works which almost ruined everything, as it was on the February 2nd episode of SmackDown that The Rock came back to challenge Roman at Mania instead, forcing Cody to step aside in the process. Obviously then, this was not what fans wanted to see. No, they wanted to see their guy finish the story finally. And so it was that a bit of fan backlash broke out, and The Rock would now morph into his villainous final boss persona, and the main event of WrestleMania 40 Night 1 would be a tag match pitting he and his cousin Roman against Cody and another enemy-turned-friend in Seth Rollins. What would be the stipulation here? Well, if the heels lost, then the Bloodline would be banned from ringside for the big world title match the following evening. If the faces lost, however, it would be Bloodline rules, with this putting us back in the same situation we were in a year prior when the odds became too much for the American Nightmare to overcome. And it would be The Rock who ended up pinning Cody here, meaning that as Night 2 of WrestleMania dawned, the challenger was at his lowest ebb yet. But this wouldn't mean he was down and out completely. No, as the big showdown between him and Roman came on April 7th, the challenger would bring some friends along for the ride with him. And that turned the whole thing into a scene which has since been described as WWE's version of Avengers Endgame. Yes, everyone got involved as over the course of the bout, there were interference spots from Jimmy Uso, Jey Uso, Solo Sikoa, John Cena, The Rock, Seth Rollins, and The Undertaker, with all of these ultimately nullifying each other and allowing Cody to hit a final crossroads at the 33-minute mark to become the new undisputed WWE Universal Champ and finally end Roman's reign of dominance. Yes, Cody Rhodes was now the new top dog in WWE. His story was complete. Here was someone that, after everything he'd gone through, had proven he really had it in him to be the face of WWE. Where would he go from here? Well, defend his title against all comers, of course, with the first defenses being against AJ Styles and Logan Paul. And after that, he'd fall back into the orbit of the Bloodline as then leader of the group, Solo Sikoa, challenged him at SummerSlam on August 3rd. But Cody would manage to win this one, all with the help of a very unexpected ally in a returning Roman Reigns. That's right, for the first time, Reigns and Rhodes were now on the same side, and this led to them going as far as to team up together at Bad Blood on October 5th to take on and defeat the combined threat of Solo Sikoa and Jacob Fatu. So with the Bloodline now in his rearview mirror again for the time being, Cody would move on to further defenses as the year ended, with this seeing him end up on the opposite side of the ring to the likes of Gunther and Kevin Owens. And it was the KO feud which saw the champ briefly bring back the old Winged Eagle design at Saturday night's main event on December 14th. As to where he is now in 2025, well, after dispatching of Kevin Owens once and for all at the Royal Rumble, Cody is now officially on the road to WrestleMania 41. Yes, it's been one hell of a ride for Cody Rhodes, and who knows what's to come in his future. Maybe we've still yet to see the best of the American Nightmare. WWE has had a long history of great in-ring performers, as we've seen with the likes of Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and Eddie Guerrero. And this is also the case for today's subject, as Gunther has proven to be one of the greatest in-ring technicians of his generation. But how did he get to this point? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into his entire career journey so far in Ring General, the Gunther story. Walter Hahn was born August 20th, 1987 in Vienna, Austria, and it was there that from a young age, he became fascinated with the world of wrestling. As happened with many people once they reached their teenage years though, the youngster began to fall away from wrestling once he started to become more enamored with soccer, with his team of choice being the German Bundesliga squad FC Schalke 04. In fact, so interested would he be in soccer back then, he'd start playing regularly as a goalie, all in the hopes that this would eventually lead to him getting a chance to turn pro. But while Walter would eventually go pro as an athlete, it wouldn't be in the world of soccer. No, after rediscovering wrestling again during the Attitude Era, he decided this has been his real passion all along. And that's what caused him to start training in the ways of the ring himself after coming across Michael Kovac and the Wrestling School of Austria at the start of the 2000s. How would this training go for the rookie? Would the €35 he was being asked to pay for lessons, a fortune for him at the time, be worth the money? Yes, it would, as almost immediately he took to the craft like a duck to water. Hell, you could call him a prodigy. And so it was that by the time 2005 came around, he'd be ready to start hitting the ring on the local Austrian indie shows where he went by the name of Big Van Walter, a reference to the legendary Big Van Vader. Not that Walter was happy with being given this moniker at first though, as he found it a little too limiting. And that was why he'd soon drop it in favor of simply going by his Christian name. And while this might have sounded like a questionable name for a wrestler at first, the fact that he was such a powerhouse, such a stiff and brutal worker, made it work, as seeing the kinds of matches he was having coming from a guy named Walter just fit for some strange reason. Needless to say then, almost immediately the Vienna native would become something of a splash on his local indie scene. And the notoriety he gained there, getting to have early matches against the likes of Colt Cabana and Pac, soon led to him getting to tour the world and show off his skills in other places as well. Where would some of these places be? Well, Japan for one. Yes, it was out in the land of the rising sun that Walter got to wrestle for the likes of Pro Wrestling 01 Max, all while he was doing additional training in their dojos and further honing his craft. And when he wasn't doing that, he was over in Germany making a new home base for himself in West Side Extreme Wrestling, the very place he'd eventually become a 4-time WXW World Tag Team Champion alongside partners like Zack Sabre Jr., Timothy Thatcher, and Ilya Dragunov, as well as a 3-time WXW Unified World Wrestling Champion. So to say the Austrian wasn't fast rising up the ranks here would be a lie. No, he was clearly one to watch for the future, especially as his in-ring style of chopping people until they're dead stood out so much amidst a sea of high flyers and acrobats. Of course, it wasn't all about title wins while Walter was in West Side Extreme Wrestling though. No, it was also about having the best match on the card, something he almost always did whenever he stepped into the ring. That said, it helped that given his increased notoriety by now, all the best workers wanted to mix it up with him, and that meant aside from getting to partner up with people like Zack Sabre Jr. and Timothy Thatcher, he also got a chance to square off against the likes of Jon Moxley and El Generico, all while he was also forming a stable around himself named Catch Hools. Would it be Catch Hools who led the up-and-comer to that first big world title win? Yes, in the sense that they were standing in his corner when he beat Zack Sabre Jr. for this in March of 2010, but it wasn't like he needed them there. No, the future Gunther was more than capable of handling himself without any outside aid, and this was something he'd prove when he ended up holding on to the WXW Unified World Wrestling Championship for the next 383 days, with all this happening before he'd even turned 25. Truly, what fans of the German promotion were seeing here was a superstar being born. And they weren't the only ones seeing it, because by now, after winning the WXW Unified World Wrestling Championship for a second time, Walter had started making his way across the channel over to the UK too, where he was regularly found working on their indie circuit for places like Progress Wrestling and Revolution Pro Wrestling. Hell, it was in the UK that he'd first get to stand on the opposite side of the ring from all new opponents, like Jordan Devlin, Eddie Kingston, Brody Lee, and Tommy End, better known today as Malachi Black. Still though, for as much fun as the Austrian was having over in England, it was West Side Extreme Wrestling that remained his home. And it was there that in 2014, after rebranding himself as Big Daddy Walter for a while, he'd have his third run with that promotion's top prize. Who would some of his challengers be this go-around? Well, that would be names like Johnny Gargano and Chris Hero. And proving just how good he was by this point, Walter was able to dispatch each of these performers, as well as everyone else who came up against him, with relative ease. Yes, the reality is that if you were stepping in the ring with the Austrian, you were going to have to prepare to get beaten up, as there was simply nothing else going on in the wrestling back then which compared to what he was doing. And that style continued to work wonders for him as 2015 came around, or at least it did until Vince Russo showed up in West Side Extreme Wrestling as the company's kayfabe new investor, and then proceeded to screw the champion out of his gold. So, needing to pick himself back up again if he was ever going to recover, Big Daddy Walter decided to move back to tag team action for a while, with this being the point he teamed up with Zack Sabre Jr. to win the WXW World Tag Team Championship after beating Red Dragon for the honor. Meanwhile, back over in the UK, the big man would continue working for Progress and Rev Pro, with it being in the latter that he came painfully close to earning a shot at the undisputed British Heavyweight Championship after stepping into the ring with Big Damo, Jonathan Gresham, and Tomohiro Ishii. Ultimately, though, a few notable losses in Rev Pro meant Big Daddy Walter would not get his shot at that gold, and with this also being around the time he and Zack Sabre Jr. came up short in a tag title defense back over in Germany, it was clear to the boy from Vienna that he needed to shake things up again. So that was exactly what he did in 2016 when he dropped Zack, started calling himself simply Walter again, and began aligning himself with Axel Dieter Jr. and Timothy Thatcher to create Ringkampf, a group of mat-based shooters who operated on the belief that the mat was a sacred place and not something to be sullied with theatrics. No, from now on, whenever any of these three men were in the ring, there would be no goofiness, and there would certainly be no high-flying or acrobatics. Instead, there will be simple meat and potatoes wrestling, the kind that the likes of Karl Gotch and Lou Thez had made famous decades before. And with this change, Walter was finally able to reach his final form, as now whenever he wrestled, he truly felt like the best wrestler in the world and the best representative of what the sport could be when it was at its purest. Obviously then, once Ringkampf were firmly established in Westside Extreme Wrestling, Der Ring General's stock began to rise all over again, and that would lead to him having excellent performances there between 2016 and 2017 against opponents like Matt Riddle, Speedball Mike Bailey, and Jeff Cobb. And while this was happening, back over in the UK for Progress Wrestling, the trio would be tearing it up against a whole host of other opponents too. Opponents such as the British Strong Style trio made up of Pete Dunne, Trent Seven, and Tyler Bate. Yes, there weren't many people on the 2010s indie circuit who Walter hadn't faced off against at this point and had a banger with in the process. And that understandably led to people asking if he would inevitably get signed up to WWE at some point. But with the Austrian not wanting to move to America at that time, this was seemingly off the cards for him. No, instead it would be Axel Dieter Jr. who would be the first member of Ringkampf to be signed in April of 2017, with this leaving the group to have to reassemble again as a duo. Not that they were slowed down by such an act though. No, by the time it was over, Walter and Timothy Thatcher would be in possession of the WXW World Tag Team Championships. And that was only a taster for what was to come as it happened, because in the spring of 2018, Walter would add another trophy to his increasingly full cabinet when he beat Travis Banks to become the Progress Unified World Champion over in the UK. Then, once he'd won this belt, he'd head over to America to start performing for Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, with it being here that, after competing in the annual Battle of Los Angeles tournament, he not only won the PWG World Tag Team titles with Timothy Thatcher, but he also defeated Keith Lee and Jonah Rock in a three-way bout on April 21st to become the PWG World Champion too. Honestly, at this point, it was easier to list the things the future World Heavyweight Champion hadn't achieved yet, and any of those things he hadn't yet done, he soon would, as around this time, he also began making appearances for Evolve, there becoming a semi-regular against performers like Chris Dickinson, Adam Cole, and Darby Allin. Outside of that, there was his time spent in Ireland for Over the Top Wrestling, the very place where, in August of 2018, Walter beat Jordan Devlin to become the OTT champion. And after winning that belt, the big man would go on to have what at the time was arguably a career best run with it, as he defended against not only old opponents like Pac, but also new ones in David Starr and Will Ospreay, all before dropping it back to Devlin again following 210 days of being in possession of it. Why had Walter dropped the OTT title here? Well, because by this point, we were reaching the end days of his indie run. That's right, despite holding off on going to WWE for so long on account of not wanting to move to America, it was in November of 2018 that a new avenue towards the WWE opened up for him with the creation of NXT UK, an entirely British-based branch of the developmental brand that would see the Austrian be allowed to work for the company, all while remaining in Europe. So with NXT UK being his new home for the future, it meant it was time to go on a farewell run of all his old haunts. And that's what led to goodbye bouts in places like Progress, OTT, Rev Pro, and most importantly, Westside Extreme Wrestling, with his last full-time match in the latter coming when Ringkampf dropped their tag team titles to Aussie Open. After that, it was all NXT UK for the big man, and he certainly made an early splash on this brand when, in January of 2019, at TakeOver Blackpool, he made a surprise appearance to confront then NXT United Kingdom champion Pete Dunne. Would this lead to a feud breaking out between the two? Of course it would. And when the inevitable title match eventually happened at TakeOver New York just 3 months later on April 5th, it would be there that Walter dethroned the incoming champ and started his own lengthy reign on top. And we mean lengthy here because for the next 870 days, there would be no one who could take that title away from Der Ring General. Sure, part of the reason for this was because the bulk of the reign happened during lockdown, and so matches were further and fewer between, but even then, to say this was an impressive run on top would be an understatement, as during his time with the strap, the future Intercontinental Champion would defend against everyone who was put up against him, with his list of opponents here including the likes of Tyler Bate, Adam Cole, Joe Coffey, Tommaso Ciampa, and Ilya Dragunov. Hell, the first bout Walter had against Dragunov on the October 29th, 2020 episode of NXT UK TV was so good, it actually managed to stand out during a period where no fans were in attendance at WWE shows. In fact, you could argue it was actually one of the very rare matches that was better for this, because with there being no crowd noise to drown things out, it meant every chop, every strike between the two in their insanely stiff bout sounded like a gunshot going off. Of course, Walter would end up winning this one, as he had with every defense up until then, but then it was a lot easier for him to be confident about winning on NXT UK, as by now he'd assembled a new stable around himself, one made up of allies both old and new. Yes, this group named Imperium, which served as a spiritual successor to Ringkampf in that they would also go by the mantra that the mat was sacred, would include not only Fabian Eichner and Alexander Wolf, but also the big man's old West Side Extreme Wrestling cohort Alex Dieter Jr., with Dieter now going by the moniker of Marcel Bartel. In the end though, even with Imperium by his side, Walter's time was going to have to run out sooner or later, and that ultimately happened for him when, at TakeOver 36 on August 22nd, 2021, not long after fans had returned to arenas, he dropped his NXT United Kingdom title to Ilya Dragunov during their highly anticipated rematch. How would he bounce back after this? Well, by moving up to NXT's US branch full-time. That's right, after years of fighting it, the Vienna native finally decided to move to America, and with him now being available to show up on the Black and Gold brand on a regular basis going forward, Triple H would waste no time in going all in with him by changing his name to Gunther and having him enter into rivalries with the likes of L.A. Knight and Braun Breaker. And not long after this, Gunther would get his official main roster call-up alongside Marcel Bartel. And so it was then that on the June 20th, 2022 episode of SmackDown, he would become Intercontinental Champion after beating Ricochet for that honor. With even more good news coming Gunther's way when Triple H began to take over as head of creative, someone who was a huge fan of the new Intercontinental Champion and who was going to book him strong. As you can probably guess then, from that point onwards, Gunther's time as Intercontinental Champion would be fantastic, with it being one of the best title runs WWE had seen in years. Seriously, Gunther was showing up week in and week out being the absolute workhorse, and he'd continue to put on banger after banger on the blue brand and the red brand once he was eventually moved over to Raw too. Yes, it didn't matter if it was Shinsuke Nakamura, Rey Mysterio, Braun Strowman, or Sheamus who he was going up against. Every Gunther title defense became appointment TV right at a time WWE was beginning to undergo its renaissance. Hell, his match against Sheamus at September 3rd, 2022's Clash at the Castle would be so good, many would herald it as being one of the greatest matches in decades. Obviously then, this put the Master of the Chop on top of the world, and his position there was only strengthened once Fabian Eichner joined the main roster too, and Imperium once more became a three-man act. Where could Gunther possibly go after this? Well, he'd enter into the 2023 Royal Rumble and there steal the show by entering at number 1 and hanging in the ring for a full 1 hour, 11 minutes, and 40 seconds before being eliminated by eventual winner Cody Rhodes, with this breaking the record for the longest single Royal Rumble performance. Following that, he'd walk into WrestleMania 39, still the Intercontinental Champion, looking to defend against the double threat of Sheamus and Drew McIntyre. Of course, while many may have thought this was the end of Gunther's reign, it would not be. No, by the time that triple threat bout was all said and done, the Austrian would still be standing tall. And as if things couldn't be going any better for him in his life at this point, it would also be around that time that he and his longtime girlfriend, wrestler Ginny, would get married in a ceremony held in London. But he had no time to settle down and enjoy married life as, still the Intercontinental Champion, the big man had dates to fulfill and defenses to make. And these defenses would include beating Mustafa Ali at May 27th's Night of Champions, Matt Riddle at July 1st's Money in the Bank, and Drew McIntyre again at August 5th's SummerSlam. Seriously, at this point, it looked like Gunther might just hold on to the secondary prize for the rest of time. In fact, by now, he was actually approaching the Honky Tonk Man's record for the longest ever IC title reign at 454 days. The only person that stood in his way of breaking this anymore was one Chad Gable. But while Gable may have been the sentimental favorite going into the pair's showdown on the September 4th, 2023 episode of Raw, in the end it would be Gunther who retained, with this allowing to break the record and officially become the longest reigning Intercontinental Champion of all time. But even then, the boy from Vienna wasn't done. No, before the year was out, he'd have further successful defenses against the likes of Tommaso Ciampa, Bronson Reed, and The Miz. And as 2023 ended, then he'd be able to go home to celebrate the birth of his first child, safe in the knowledge that he was making his kid proud by holding on to that particular piece of hardware for as long as he was. How would 2024 go for the new dad once he returned to the ring? Well, exactly the way 2023 had, because in the first few months of the year, he'd rack up additional victories over Kofi Kingston and Jey Uso. Unfortunately for him, however, time was coming on his reign, and that time would be at WrestleMania 40, as it was there that after a war with Sami Zayn, Gunther finally dropped the IC strap. But considering his run had lasted for a full 666 days, it meant he wasn't exactly going to slip down the card afterwards. No, he'd remain a very focused upon act over on the Raw brand, and that would see him be entered into the King of the Ring tournament when the time for this came around in April. Yes, like the final boss he was fast becoming, Gunther went on to win the King of the Ring after beating Randy Orton in the finals at King and Queen of the Ring on May 25th. And because he won this, it would mean he'd get to challenge Damian Priest for the World Heavyweight title at August 3rd's SummerSlam. Of course, by that point, Priest was on a hell of a run, so there was some doubt as to whether or not Gunther would be able to topple him. But anyone who had any doubts about the Austrian's chances were proven wrong when at the biggest show of the summer, he beat the champ with relative ease to start his first reign as a world champion on the WWE main roster. And that's where things stand today, because ever since August of 2024, Gunther has remained the King of Raw, with his list of victims over the course of his reign including Randy Orton, Sami Zayn, Finn Balor, and Damian Priest once more. Where will he be in 2025? More than likely, he'll still be on top. In fact, we fully expect to see him roll into WrestleMania 41 in April, still with the gold around his waist. Of course, the question remains as to who he might end up facing at that show. Some have suggested it might be CM Punk, others meanwhile have suggested it may be Seth Rollins. Hell, others have put forward that it could be a younger talent like Braun Breaker or a legend like Bill Goldberg. Whoever it is, they'll have to bring their A-game, because based on what we've seen so far, Gunther doesn't look like someone willing to drop that title anytime soon. No, if he has his way, he'll be the champ for a long time to come yet. In the early 2010s, the women's division in WWE was at a low ebb. That was until one woman came along and started the first sparks of a revolution that would turn things around. But how did it all happen? Well, join us as we take a deep dive into AJ Lee's incredible journey right now. April Jeanette Mendez was born on March 19, 1987 in Union City, New Jersey to a home health aide mother named Janet and an automotive engineer father named Robert. And this meant a working-class upbringing for the young girl and her two siblings, one in which money was not always in abundance. Hell, so tight did things get at times, in fact, the family would occasionally have to live in motels or even in their car for weeks on end when they couldn't afford to pay the rent. And this contributed toward April developing mental health issues at a young age. That said, it wasn't like things were all bad during her childhood. No, April did find an outlet for joy in professional wrestling, with this being something she was introduced to by her brother when she was still just a preteen. To her, seeing the likes of Lita doing her thing on screen made the future Divas champion want to do the same. And that wasn't the only tomboyish interest AJ had back then, as, unlike many of her peers at school, she was also very into things like comic books, anime, and video games. Of course, while all of this provided fun entertainment for her, none of it felt like a viable career path. And so that was why, upon graduating from Memorial High School in West New York in 2005, April would enroll in New York University's Tisch School of Arts, where she planned to study film and TV production. But unfortunately for her, she'd never get a chance to finish this course because, as a result of continuing financial issues with her and her family, she'd be forced to drop out after just 6 months. Where would AJ go from here? Well, now feeling like she had nothing to lose, she'd start doing odd jobs here and there in order to pay for wrestling training. That said, this was a difficult thing for her to manage, especially as around that time she'd formerly been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, something her mother had also suffered from. Thankfully though, she would manage to do this under the tutelage of Ring of Honor legend Jay Lethal, someone who April would even begin a short romantic relationship with here, with this all leading up to her in-ring debut in the New Jersey Independent Circuit in late 2007. At that point in time, AJ would be going by the name of Miss April, and it was under this name that she'd find early success in Women's Superstars Uncensored as one half of that company's tag team champions alongside Brooke Carter. Still, while this was a great early achievement for the young rookie, it wasn't the limit of what she could achieve, and she knew this. So when WWE came calling in May of 2009, inviting April to attend a tryout camp, she jumped at the chance. And after impressing the right people there, she'd be rewarded with a developmental contract, one which would see her report to Florida Championship Wrestling with immediate effect, and there change her name, first to April Lee, and then later to AJ Lee. Why AJ Lee? Well, this, as it turned out, came from April's love of anime. Yes, one of her favorite anime series, the legendary Cowboy Bebop, featured a voice actor for the English dub who went by the name of Wendy Lee. So as a tribute to her love of this series and that particular voice actor, AJ took part of their name as her wrestling moniker. And with that now set upon, she'd begin rising up the ranks of FCW, quickly beating Serena Mancini to win the Queen of FCW Championship in February of 2010. Where would AJ go from there? Even higher as it happened, because a few months later, she'd win a tournament designed to crown the inaugural FCW Divas Champion too. And after that, she'd rack up a string of successful defenses against the likes of Naomi. Ultimately though, this would not be enough to stop her from eventually losing both of her titles come the spring of 2011. And once that happened, there wasn't much left for April to do in Florida Championship Wrestling. So realizing this, it was here that she made the next step in her career when she became a cast member of Season 3 of NXT, back when that show was in its original game show format. And here, in an all-female season of the show, AJ managed to stand out from the crowd as someone who was not the traditional buxom blonde the company had on their roster at the time. No, as a self-proclaimed awkward nerd, she struck a chord with a large part of the fan base. And while she wouldn't go on to win the tournament, with her ultimately finishing in third place instead, she would be brought up to the main roster from here anyway, as WWE clearly saw something in her as being their resident geek goddess. How would AJ do going forward now that she was on the main roster and had a character which set her apart from her contemporaries? Pretty well as it happened, because almost immediately she'd be put into a tag team with fellow NXT competitor and close friend in real life, Caitlyn, with this team going by the name of the Chickbusters. And after a while, a third member would also be added in the form of the more experienced Natalya, something which helped this trio go on to pick up victories against opponents such as Alicia Fox, Tamina Snuka, and Rosa Mendez. But it wasn't just in the ring that AJ was making her presence felt during these early months on the main roster. No, she was also getting involved in some extracurricular on-screen stuff with some of the guys too, with the first of her many kayfabe romances happening here when she, for a brief time, started seeking the affections of Hornswoggle. Not that this romance lasted for long, however. No, after a few months, the whole thing was in the rearview mirror for the Union City native. And the same would be said about her Chickbusters union too, because it would be in mid-2011 that Natalya would decide she'd had enough of the pair of rookies and would turn on them, instead aligning herself with Beth Phoenix. That's right, the stage was now set for the new union of the Divas of Doom to go to war with Lee and Caitlyn for a while, with this being exactly what happened throughout the remainder of 2011. And as that was happening, AJ was finding kayfabe love again when she began an on-screen relationship with Daniel Bryan. Of course, this was back during the days when the American Dragon was playing the role of an abusive heel, and this led to him often treating AJ very badly during segments, both backstage and in the ring. How would all of this reach its boiling point? Well, that would happen at WrestleMania 28 on April 1st, 2012, the now infamous night in which Bryan lost his World Heavyweight title to Sheamus in just 18 seconds after AJ inadvertently distracted him with a kiss before the bell rang. So, because the Dragon blamed his girlfriend for costing him his gold, he'd dump her afterwards. And this would cause Lee's character to begin losing her mind. Yes, it was here that April started acting more and more like a crazy woman, with this even causing her to turn on her best friend, Caitlyn. And like with any good character change, it also saw her change up her look too. What would this new look entail? Well, rather than the more traditional ring gear she'd worn before, Lee would now start coming out to the ring in Chuck Taylor shoes and jean shorts, something she chose for herself for two reasons. One, because it was the kind of clothing she liked to wear in her daily life, and two, understanding the growing importance of convention culture in wrestling, she knew it would be an easy outfit to cosplay with. And with this all now set and her transformation complete, AJ was fully able to move to the next phase of her career, a phase which would see her reach levels of popularity few women in WWE had been able to do in years by then. That's right, by the time mid-2012 came around, the New Jersey woman was becoming a central figure on the Raw brand, largely on account of her involvement in the WWE title feud between Daniel Bryan and then world champion CM Punk. You see, in seeking revenge on her kayfabe ex-boyfriend, AJ began seeking the affections of his rival at the time instead. And that wasn't the only person AJ was romancing here. No, she also seemed to find a new potential love in Kane at one point. Really though, the main focus was Punk and Bryan, and this led to her notably acting as the special guest referee during their WWE title match at that July's Money in the Bank pay-per-view, with her here playing games with each man for her own amusement. But that was only for her own amusement, and in the end, AJ would pick the man she wanted anyway, with this being the American Dragon, something she did by proposing to him right in the middle of the ring. And now, apparently a changed man, Bryan would counter this by proposing to her too. So it was that at Raw 1000, the biggest WWE wedding since Billy and Chuck was set to take place between the two lovebirds. Of course, like with Billy and Chuck, however, this one never actually got finalized because, upon revealing that she'd been playing games with Bryan all along as a means of revenge for the way he'd treated her before, AJ left her fiancé at the altar. And once she did that, she'd announced that going forward, Vince McMahon had given her the job of the new general manager of Raw, meaning things were going to be very difficult not only for the American Dragon in the coming weeks and months, but also for CM Punk too, her other remaining romantic interest by then. How would she make life difficult for both of them throughout the rest of the summer and autumn? Well, by doing things like denying any requests they made and booking them in matches they didn't want to be a part of. And when AJ wasn't doing that, she was also causing problems for other prominent figures on the show, like Paul Heyman and Vicky Guerrero. And in the end, this would all eventually lead to the board of directors losing faith in her abilities as a boss and forcing her to step down on October 22nd after allegations came to light that she was involved in yet another kayfabe romance, this time with John Cena. That's right, as Vicky Guerrero would claim here, Lee was abusing her position of power by having a relationship with an underling. And though both parties would deny there was any kind of relationship going on, eventually they would start hooking up on screen, with it seeming like the whole thing had inadvertently brought them closer together and led to them actually becoming a storyline item. Even then though, Big Match John always seemed hesitant to plunge fully into the relationship as much of AJ's crazy behavior troubled him. And that proved to be a smart move on his part, as it would be at December 16th, 2012's TLC Tables, Ladders, and Chairs pay-per-view that during his match against Dolph Ziggler, the Union City native would screw him by pushing him off a ladder right when it looked like he was about to win the Money in the Bank contract, then being held by the show-off. Obviously then, this was not something Cena was happy with, and he was even less happy when the following night on Raw, AJ solidified the fact she'd found herself a new man when she teamed with Ziggler to take on Big Match John and Vicky Guerrero. But it wasn't just Mr. Money in the Bank she now had by her side. No, this new duo was soon to become a trio, as before the night was over, Big E Langston would have arrived to reveal that he was going to be the group's muscle going forward. Yes, this was the beginning of a heel group which some fans came to call Team Rocket on account of the similarities AJ, Dolph, and Big E had to the triplet of villains from the Pokemon series. And now that they were together, they would go on to wage war with the Raw and SmackDown rosters well into 2013. Hell, so much would they have each other's backs here when Lee got into an argument with her kayfabe ex-boyfriend Daniel Bryan during a backstage segment in March of 2013. Dolph and Big E would jump in to protect her honor, with this then leading to a match for the WWE Tag Team titles the American Dragon was then holding with Kane, taking place at WrestleMania 29. Unfortunately though, the heels would not be able to win this one. But that was a loss that was soon forgotten about anyway, because the very next night on Raw, Ziggler would come out to the ring unannounced to cash in his Money in the Bank contract on Alberto Del Rio in one of the greatest cash-ins of all time. Of course, none of this should suggest AJ was happy to just play the girlfriend role going ahead, standing at the sidelines and watching as her man had all the success in the ring. No, she continued to have ambitions of being a championship-level performer herself. And this would all lead to her entering a battle royal on the April 22nd, 2013 episode of Raw and going on to win it, in the process becoming the #1 contender to the Divas title, then being held by her former best friend, Kaitlyn. What followed on from that? Well, one of the early examples of things turning around for women in the WWE, as here was a match that was very good and which ended with a new champion being crowned as AJ Lee began her lengthy reign on top. Yes, while the Four Horsewomen have a big part to play in the rise of women's wrestling in WWE during the mid-2010s, and while Paige and Emma down in NXT were arguably the original spark which started it all, this match also has a major role to play by putting on a great women's match on the main roster for the first time in years. That said, a great match in a vacuum is just that, a great match in a vacuum. And if you want to have a great title reign, you need to keep delivering night in and night out. And this was something AJ was all too aware of, as over the months which followed, she continued to defend against all comers. That said, keeping hold of the butterfly belt wouldn't be enough to stop yet another kayfabe relationship from falling apart for her, as, after Dolph Ziggler lost the World Heavyweight title to Alberto Del Rio in a rematch from that famous cash-in, he'd blame his girlfriend for the defeat and would proceed to kick her to the curb. How would Lee respond to this? Well, continuing to align herself with Big E, she'd seek revenge on Dolph, with this all leading to a mixed tag team match pitting her and Langston against Ziggler and Kaitlyn at SummerSlam on August 18th of that year. And while the heels would lose this one, AJ would continue to be the Divas champion coming out of the event. So that meant more defenses against the likes of Brie Bella, Naomi, and Natalya, all while she was finding a new bodyguard in Tamina Snuka. That's right, in an attempt to help her out in her new war against the cast of Total Divas, the New Jersey native had enlisted a heater, similar to the way Shawn Michaels had with Diesel back in the day. And this would work out well for her because whether it be at Night of Champions in September, Survivor Series in November, or TLC Tables, Ladders, and Chairs in December, AJ would always keep the belt around her waist by the time the evening was over. And that all led to a situation where, by January of 2014, she'd officially become the longest reigning Divas champion of all time, quite an achievement for someone who many in management had originally written off as not fitting the mold for a WWE diva back in the early to mid 2010s. But that reign wasn't going to last much longer if SmackDown general manager Vickie Guerrero had anything to say about it. No, given the history between those two women, Vickie wanted the belt off of Lee here. And that led to her stacking the odds against the champ at WrestleMania 30, where she'd defend her gold against 13 other women at once. But even if this was overwhelming odds for AJ to overcome, she proved up to the challenge as, in the bout where, for the first time ever, the Divas Championship had been put on the line at the Showcase of the Immortals, she came out victorious by the end, with this seeming to solidify her as a forever champion going forward. But she would not have been a forever champion as it happened, because it would be the very next night on Raw that she'd finally drop her gold to, of all people, a debuting Paige. That's right, in her first night on the main roster, Paige was able to upset AJ Lee and end her historic run on top. And following a brief sabbatical for the now former champion here, this led to the two continuing to feud over the months which followed when she returned. Why had she asked for a break in between losing the gold, then coming back to challenge for it again? Well, aside from just needing a break after such a lengthy reign, this was also the point she was getting married to her by then real-life fiancé, CM Punk. Of course, given the state of Punk's relationship with WWE here, with him having walked out earlier that year and then being formally fired on he and AJ's wedding day, it meant that once the ex-Divas champion returned, there was going to be an awkward atmosphere everywhere she went. Not that anyone seemed to blame her for the way things had gone with her husband though. But despite this, it was still difficult for her to come to work every day, especially after lawsuits started being thrown around and the bitterness between WWE and Punk intensified to nuclear levels. So really, in hindsight, it should have been clear that there was a countdown on now, ticking down the days until she eventually parted ways with the promotion too. Before that would happen though, AJ would spend the remainder of 2014 switching to the babyface side of the roster again, as she and a now heel Paige did battle at Battleground, SummerSlam, Night of Champions, and Hell in a Cell. And when that was over, she'd shift her focus back over to the Bella Twins. Come November, however, a nagging neck injury would see her be forced to take some more time off, with this keeping her out of action until March of the following year, by which point her relationship with WWE was starting to grow somewhat frosty too. What had happened during her time away to cause this? Well, it was mostly confined to a tweet Lee had sent out in response to Stephanie McMahon around about the point of her return, with the Union City Girl calling out the fact that women in WWE were still being paid only a fraction of their male counterparts. Obviously then, given all the issues her husband was having with the company here, this sent alarm bells ringing amongst fans. And those alarm bells were merited as it happened, because after teaming up with her old rival Paige to take on the Bella Twins at WrestleMania 31, then appearing in one more 6-woman match the following night on Raw, AJ Lee would announce her retirement from the ring, with her reasons being a combination of continued neck injuries and the increasingly tense situation between WWE and CM Punk. But while this was it for AJ as a wrestler, it wasn't the end of her life as a public figure. No, over the years which followed, she continued to remain in the public eye, becoming both a mental health activist and an author, with her memoir, Crazy Is My Superpower, debuting at number 10 on the New York Times bestsellers list. On top of that, she's also developed comic books centered around both pro wrestling and Dungeons & Dragons with her writing partner Amy Garcia, all while she was occasionally dipping her toe into the world of acting with cameo roles here and there. Of course, what wrestling fans always wanted to know though was, would AJ ever return to the ring? With this question only becoming louder once CM Punk returned to wrestling in 2021 to debut with All Elite Wrestling. And while she would never show up in AEW, Lee would reappear inside of a ring again in 2021, sort of. Yes, it was here that rather than return as an active competitor, she came back as a producer for WOW Women of Wrestling, the ladies-only promotion helmed by both Glow creator David McLean and LA Lakers owner Jeannie Buss. Ultimately though, AJ's time with WOW would be short, ending in August of 2023. And with her husband by then being on the verge of leaving AEW, it seemed like her days in the ring really were done forever. But then something happened. After CM Punk returned to WWE later that year, speculation once more began arising about whether or not his wife would find her way there again too. And while it took a while for this speculation to lead to anything, on the September 5th, 2025 episode of SmackDown, Lee would in fact make a comeback to partner up with her husband in his ongoing war against Seth Rollins and Becky Lynch. So it may very well be that we have a lot more AJ to enjoy in the future, as she continues to light it up everywhere she goes. It's rare for a mid-card wrestler to break out into the main event scene, especially if most of their career has been spent as a tag team act. So that's why it's so nice then when someone who fans are behind truly does break through that glass ceiling and reaches the top of the card. And this is exactly what Jey Uso has achieved. Yes, this is a man who has taken the wrestling world by storm, but how did he get to this point? Well, join us as we take a deep dive into the entire tale right now. Joshua Samuel Fatu was born on August 22, 1985 in San Francisco, California, a mere 9 minutes after his twin brother Jonathan. And with him being so closely interlinked with his brother from the day of his birth then, it should come as no surprise the two would be linked at the hip all throughout their youths, with their father, former Intercontinental Champion Rikishi, often having to deal with both at the same time whenever they were wrestling with one another around the house. Yes, as members of the famed Anoa'i family, the family which also includes the likes of the Wild Samoans, Yokozuna, The Rock, and Roman Reigns, just to name a few, wrestling was always going to be in Joshua and Jonathan's blood. But that didn't mean the pair didn't have other interests during their school years too. In fact, in Joshua's case specifically, he'd get involved in football while studying at Escambia High School. And this would eventually lead to him taking on the role of linebacker for his college team at the University of West Alabama when he studied there between 2003 and 2005. Really, at this point, it may have been a possibility for Joshua to skip wrestling entirely and start up a career as a football player. It was certainly what his coach, Sam McCorkle, hoped was going to happen for him. But despite having someone like this pushing for him to go further on the gridiron, in the end, the youngster felt he wasn't getting the success he wanted out of the sport. And so it was then that after graduating college, Jay and his brother would work in a furniture moving store. That was until their uncle Umaga saw the potential they had and decided to encourage the twins to start training in the family business, with the pair following their uncle and began training. How would this training go? Pretty well as it happened, because by the time 2007 rolled around, the Fatu twins, as Joshua and Jonathan were then calling themselves, would make their in-ring debut for World Extreme Wrestling in Milton, Florida. And not long after that, the pair would even make a few appearances for places like the National Wrestling Alliance. Ultimately though, it was always going to be a matter of time until they got picked up by WWE. And that would happen 3 years later in 2010 when Vince McMahon decided to sign the Fatu twins up to a developmental contract and from there send them to Florida Championship Wrestling, where they'd be rebranded as the Uso Brothers. And here Joshua and Jonathan would forge their paths as they got started in FCW by challenging teams like the Rotunda Brothers and the Fortunate Sons. Hell, it would be the latter team who they actually beat on March 13th of that year to become FCW Florida Tag Team Champions. And after they had these belts in their possession, they'd go on to defend them against a string of challengers in pretty good defenses, with all this ultimately leading to the boss taking notice and deciding it was time to call them up to the main roster just a few months later. Yes, it was on the May 24th, 2010 episode of Raw, just 5 months after they debuted in FCW, that the pair, now going by the name of Jay and Jimmy Uso, would make their main roster debuts. And boy, would they make a splash here, because with Tamina by their side, they'd go straight after then unified WWE Tag Team Champions, the Hart Dynasty. Unfortunately though, despite their best efforts, the Usos would not be able to take the gold away from the Hart Dynasty at this early stage in the game. No, instead, they'd fail in their various attempts to do so. And this all led to Tamina turning her back on the pair on the December 6th episode of Raw that same year, when she chose to throw in her chips with the team who had managed to win the tag titles that evening, Santino Marella and Vladimir Kozlov. Not that this would keep the Usos down for long, however. No, even if they were now without a manager, they'd continue setting out to prove why they deserve to be at the top of the card in the WWE Tag Team division. The only problem was that, now, not having anyone to help them make the plays at ringside, they'd eat high-profile losses to the likes of The Core and David Otunga and Michael McGillicuddy over the coming months. That's right, even after moving over to SmackDown and formally turning babyface, Jay and Jimmy would struggle to string together a series of victories. And after a certain point, that set people to wondering if they really were the next big thing in waiting. Luckily for them then, by the time 2012 came around, they'd have started to turn the corner by heading down to NXT for a while and getting wins over teams such as The Ascension and Kurt Hawkins and Tyler Rex. And after that was over, and they were back in the swing of things, the brothers would head back up to SmackDown, where they got the better of pairings like Darren Young and Titus O'Neil. All they needed now then was another shot at that tag team gold. And this would come for them at WrestleMania 28 on April 1st of that year, when they were a part of a triple threat WWE Tag Team title bout on the pre-show against both Tyson Kidd and Justin Gabriel, and then champions Primo and Epico. Would this be the moment the Usos finally reached the top of the mountain? And no, it wouldn't, as no matter how hard they fought, they just couldn't pick up the victory here. And that losing streak would carry on into the spring and summer of that year, as for the second time, questions began being asked about how good Jimmy and Jay really were. So realizing they had to start changing things up, otherwise fans were going to lose faith in them forever, it would be in June of 2013 that they began wearing tribal face paint designed to highlight their Samoan heritage, all while they were continuing to perform a traditional Siva Tau dance during their entrance. And this change in the way they carried themselves proved to be the start of something for the Usos, as by the time 2014 was dawning, they'd have embarked upon a winning streak, one which saw them get to challenge then WWE Tag Team Champions, the New Age Outlaws, on the March 3rd episode of Raw. Would this be the moment they finally won the gold? Yes, it would. And now that they had the titles around their waists, the pair were able to successfully defend them at the WrestleMania 30 pre-show just 1 month later against not only the Real Americans, but also Los Matadores and Rybaxel too. Of course, by this point they were on a roll, and that meant when the Wyatt family started targeting them in the summer, they'd be able to dispatch this threat with relative ease. Sure, they would ultimately lose their gold to the Rhodes brothers at Night of Champions on September 21st, but by then, they'd fully established themselves as major players, so it wasn't like such a loss was as devastating as it would have been before. No, by now, Jay and Jimmy were made men as far as the tag team division was concerned, and that was only further solidified when, just a few months later on the December 29th episode of Raw, they'd recapture the tag team titles. Sadly though, any momentum they were building here would be halted when, in early 2014, Jay suffered a shoulder injury which ended up taking him out of action for the next 6 months. And that meant no Usos on WWE TV again until November of that year, with this being the point both brothers returned to help their cousin Roman Reigns fend off the challenge of Seth Rollins, Kevin Owens, and The New Day on an episode of Raw. After that, Well, after that, they'd enter into a feud with the New Day, which saw both teams put on a great series of matches, which helped to keep the division alive during a period where it wasn't at its best. Yes, during the 2010s, the amount of focus given to tag team wrestling was arguably at an all-time low, and so it was tasked with these two teams to keep the flame burning for the most part. And boy, did they succeed at this, because whether we're talking about their match at the 2016 Royal Rumble or any of the other bouts they had throughout what remained of the decade, they almost always managed to steal the show. Of course, it wasn't just the New Day who Jimmy and Jay were fighting throughout this time, however. No, throughout 2016, they also got into notable programs with the likes of the Dudley Boys, the Good Brothers, and American Alpha. And during this period, they also rediscovered an edge they'd been missing for a few years when they turned heel on the September 6th episode of SmackDown. Sadly, though, this edge would not be enough to see them with the tag team titles over on the Blue brand during 2016. No, that wouldn't come until the March 21st, 2017 episode of SmackDown, the very place where they were able to snag the belts from Chad Gable and Jason Jordan, the pair then holding them, to become the first team to ever have held both the red and blue brand versions of Tag Team Gold in WWE. How would they celebrate this achievement? Well, by racking up win after win during their subsequent title defenses against teams such as Breezango. And when that was done, they'd reignite their feud with the New Day in a series of excellent encounters, the best of which was probably their tag team Hell in a Cell match at the titular pay-per-view on October 8th. Yes, by this point it was becoming increasingly hard to boo Jay and Jimmy. And so that was why, after this leg of their feud with the New Day ended, they'd formally turn face once more and head into 2018 as righteous defending champions. But while things were looking great in the ring for Jay at this point, outside of the ring, he got into legal trouble behind the scenes in January of 2018, something which meant he would be banned from entering countries like Canada whenever WWE headed over there for a show. Of course, given his level of talent, the hot water he found himself in was never going to last forever. No, as 2018 continued on, he'd gradually find himself getting out of the doghouse. And that would all climax with the Usos getting a chance to appear on the main card of a WrestleMania show for the first time ever on April 8th, when they defended their tag team titles against both the New Day and the Bludgeon Brothers. Sure, they would lose their gold here, but the fact they'd finally gotten a true WrestleMania moment was enough to soften the blow. And this allowed them to bounce back as the year progressed then by having great matches against opponents as wide and varied as The Bar, Team Hell No, and the Good Brothers. So it was that by the time Elimination Chamber came around on February 17th of 2019, they'd be back in the title picture, with it being here that they challenged and defeated then champions The Miz and Shane McMahon to become SmackDown Tag Team Champions once more. Sadly, though, this would prove to be a relatively short-lived title run for the Usos, because it was on the April 9th episode of SmackDown that they dropped their gold to the Hardy Boys. So after that, they'd pick themselves back up, dust themselves off, and head back over to Raw during the 2019 draft, where they'd set about climbing the ranks once more in matches against The Revival and Kurt Hawkins and Zack Ryder. Honestly, it just seemed like a matter of time until the titles were going to be back in their hands. And that's what made it hurt all the more then, when after Jimmy got himself into a legal issue behind the scenes, both brothers would find themselves pulled from TV for the remainder of the year. That's right, it wouldn't be until the January 3rd, 2020 episode of SmackDown that we saw the pair again. And this time, they'd be keeping it in the family, as upon their return, they'd immediately align themselves with Roman Reigns during his feud with Baron Corbin and Dolph Ziggler. Once again, though, any momentum they were starting to build up here would be halted when, at WrestleMania 36, Jimmy legitimately injured himself. But rather than keep both men out indefinitely here as had been done in the past, on this occasion WWE decided to try out a solo run with Jay in the meantime. And that all led to him winning a fatal four-way match on the September 4th episode of SmackDown to become the #1 contender to his cousin's Universal Championship. Of course, this wasn't the old version of the Big Dog anymore, though. No, as the autumn rolled around, Roman had turned heel and transformed into his megalomaniacal tribal chief character, one who was intent on having the rest of his family bend the knee to him as he formed a bloodline around himself. For Jay's part, however, he would at first rebel against such a demand. And that led to him having two good matches against Reigns at Clash of the Champions on September 27th and Hell in a Cell on October 25th, each of which he would ultimately lose. So because he had lost 2 in a row, then Jay felt the need to pledge loyalty to the head of the table and formally joined the Bloodline, something his brother would join him in when he returned to the ring soon thereafter. And so began the most successful storyline WWE had put out in years, as the trio, who were later joined by Solo Sikoa, proceeded to dominate the entirety of WWE television for the next several years. As to what role Jay would play in this domination specifically? Well, early on, he and his brother would be tasked with winning both the Raw and SmackDown tag team titles. And that was something they started doing when, at the Money in the Bank pre-show on July 18, 2021, they'd regained the Blue Brand's gold from Rey and Dominic Mysterio. Then, after that was over, they'd begin setting their sights on the Raw prizes too, with this being something they also won on the May 20th, 2022 episode of SmackDown after beating RK Bro for the honor. Where would they go from here? Well, continuing the Bloodline's reign of dominance, they'd defend against all comers. But by that point, Jay had other problems to deal with outside of just keeping his tag team titles, as by then, a usurper had entered his family, a usurper who went by the name of Sami Zayn. Yes, this was the point the Bloodline angle went from good to great, as untrusting of Sami, Jay would consistently act cold towards him whenever he tried to get involved in family business, with all of this arguably climaxing in the excellent Feeling Oozy segment on the October 28th episode of SmackDown that year. But whether Jay liked it or not, by now, Sami had fully ingratiated himself into the Bloodline. And as time went on, even he would come to love him when, after the honorary Uce helped secure the victory for his team at Survivor Series on November 26th inside of a War Games double cage, Jay finally hugged his new family member and accepted him into the fold. It's just a shame then that it would be mere months later on January 28, 2023 at the Royal Rumble that Sami finally decided he'd had enough of being bullied by Roman Reigns and turned on the Bloodline, something which left the youngest Uso conflicted about where his allegiances lay going forward. In the end though, he'd pick his blood. After all, by now he and Jimmy were the longest reigning tag team champions in WWE history. And that would all lead us to night 1 of WrestleMania 39 where, in the main event, the Usos would take on the team of Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens for the undisputed WWE Tag Team titles. That's right, from the pre-show to the main event, Jey Uso had come a long way. And while his team would be on the losing end that night, the momentum he was building up with fans continued on into the summer when he too decided he'd had enough of his cousin pushing him around. And so that was why he also turned on him and left the Bloodline, formally turning babyface again in the process. Where would he go from here? Well, like he had early on during the Bloodline saga, he'd go to war with Roman Reigns, and that led to Jay and Jimmy beating Roman and Solo Sikoa in a tag team bout at Money in the Bank on July 1st, with Jay actually pinning the Tribal Chief here in order to set up a third one-on-one encounter between them at SummerSlam just 1 month later. Of course, no matter how hard the man who had by then come to be known as Main Event Jey Uso tried to win this one when it came time for the bell to ring, he'd been unable to do so. No, thanks to his own brother Jimmy screwing him out of the win, as he once more aligned himself with the heel stable, Jay would be forced to stare at the lights by the time all was said and done. So realizing there was nothing left for him to do on SmackDown following this, he'd quit and instead move over to Raw, where now a true singles act for the first time in his career, he'd enjoy a wave of popularity few could have ever foreseen for him. That's not to say he'd be done with tag team action completely though. No, not long after rejoining the Red Brand, Jay would actually find himself forming an alliance with an old enemy in Cody Rhodes, one which proved successful enough for the pair to briefly win the undisputed WWE Tag Team titles from the Judgment Day at October 7th's Fastlane. But then the youngest Uce needed this alliance to get him through those early days on the Raw roster because, as a result of all the chaos he'd caused while part of the Bloodline, there were few in the babyface locker room who wanted anything to do with him. Hell, aside from the American Nightmare, the only person who would show any love towards Jay at this point would be his old friend Sami Zayn, someone who knew all too well what it was like to be trapped and brainwashed by its leader. And so, it was then that with these two men vouching for him, over time the Californian would start to win the favor of his co-workers again, all while he was getting even more over with fans on account of his new Yeet catchphrase. That said, due to a legal argument about who owned the rights to this catchphrase, there was a brief period where Jay had to stop using it, with this threatening to halt much of his momentum. Luckily for him though, any legal issues here would be quickly resolved, and so he was back to having it on his t-shirts before long, t-shirts which were now selling out everywhere he went like hotcakes. So by the time he was doing things like challenging Seth Rollins for the World Heavyweight title on the December 4th, 2023 episode of Raw, it felt like Jay being a top guy was the most natural thing in the world. Still though, for as over as he was getting, he wasn't quite ready for the world title yet. No, whenever he challenged for that belt, he'd find himself coming out on the losing end. However, at this time, he would have possibly the biggest match of his career, as at WrestleMania 40 Night 1 on April 6th of that year, he'd win the long-awaited singles match he and his brother Jimmy had. And by the time WrestleMania came to an end the following evening, he'd be right there to help Cody Rhodes win the undisputed WWE title from Roman Reigns. And after that was over, he'd continue to build up a name for himself as a single star on Raw by getting another chance to challenge for the World Heavyweight title, then being held by Damian Priest at Backlash on May 4th. Again, though, he would fail to win the big one here, and this was certainly a blow to him. But again, Jey Uso would not let this loss hold him down for long. No, like the last time he failed to win a title as a single star, he'd pick himself up and enter into that year's King of the Ring tournament, where he made it all the way to the semifinals before being eliminated by Gunther. Where would he go after that? Into the men's Money in the Bank ladder match at July 6th's titular PLE. And while Drew McIntyre came out of this one the winner instead of him, he'd just look for another pathway back towards the top. A pathway which started with him winning a fatal four-way bout against Pete Dunne, Ilya Dragunov, and Braun Strowman on the September 9th episode of Raw to become the #1 contender for the Intercontinental title. Of course, if this had been a few years prior, winning the Intercontinental title would not have been a major achievement, as by then that belt had lost much of the prestige it had in years past. But after Gunther had done such an excellent job of rehabbing it with his record-breaking run with it during the early 2020s, it now felt like a huge deal. So when Jay challenged then-champ Braun Breaker on the September 23rd episode of Raw and beat him for the secondary prize, it felt like a truly special moment for him and a culmination of all the hard work he'd put in over the years finally paying off big time. So special of a moment was it, in fact, even when he dropped the title back to Braun a few weeks later, it didn't feel like the down cycle it might have felt like before. No, by now Jey Uso was fully established as a big-time singles player on Raw, and that would mean when in the weeks leading up to Survivor Series, he made the decision to join forces with Bloodline members Roman Reigns, Sami Zayn, and his brother Jimmy again, this time as a babyface act to take on the false heel version of the group made up of Solo Sikoa, Tama Tonga, Tonga Loa, and Jacob Fatu in a War Games bout, which also included CM Punk and Bronson Reed. It didn't feel like a regression. Rather, it felt like the next natural step in the story. And not long after this, he'd have another shot at the gold when he was narrowly defeated by Gunther in January of 2025 at Saturday night's main event. The only question left then was, where would his story take him next? And the answer to that came at the Royal Rumble, as it was there that in one of the biggest surprises of the modern era, Jay entered at number 20 and went on to win the whole thing, with him beating out the likes of CM Punk, Drew McIntyre, Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, and John Cena in order to do so. Does this mean he's finally going to win that World Heavyweight title? We certainly hope so. And if he does that, in the closing bout of the biggest show of the year, he will finally have justified his name as main event Jey Uso, someone who's destined to go down as one of the biggest breakout stars of his era. In recent years, LA Knight has gotten over with fans in a completely organic way. But then why wouldn't he? Because with a top-level promo ability and charisma to burn, he really has all the elements required to be a superstar. And this is something which has been evident throughout his entire career. But how did it all happen? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into his entire journey so far in, the LA Knight story. Shawn Ricker was born on November 1st, 1982 in Hagerstown, Maryland, and it was there, as the youngest of 3 children, he'd spend his childhood being a huge wrestling fan. In fact, so big of a fan was he'd start watching at the tender young age of 3. And while it may have been the Hulkamania era which first grabbed him, by the time the new millennium rolled around and Shawn was in his teenage years, he'd have found 2 new favorite stars in Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. But perhaps this should come as no surprise given the character he would later portray, just as it should come as no surprise that in March of 2003, once the youngster turned 20, he'd move over to Cincinnati, where he'd begin his training in the ring under the tutelage of journeyman performer Cody Hawk. Of course, while he was doing this, he'd also have to support himself financially, and that meant working at both a wood mill and a local Ruby Tuesday restaurant. But in the end, all his hard work would pay off, because come early 2004, he was regularly working for Les Thatcher's Heartland Wrestling Association under the ring name of Deuce, and come November of that same year, he'd have won their television championship. Obviously, then Thatcher could tell there were big things in the future of the Maryland native, and while it would take a while for him to reach the next step in his career, eventually this came too, when in December of 2010, Ricker got a job with Championship Wrestling from Hollywood, an NWA-affiliated territory, which would see him get to team up with current AEW star Brian Cage, as the two, going by the name of The Natural Selection, went on to win the NWA Heritage Tag Team Championships and hold on to them for over 200 days. But that wasn't all Shawn was doing here, because after he and Cage predictably split and feuded with one another, the now babyface star found singles success by winning the CWFH Heritage Heavyweight Championship. Unfortunately though, this would also mark his high point in Hollywood, as on June 2nd, 2012, after getting beaten in a loser leaves town match against Scorpio Sky, it would be on to new pastures for the now former champion. What would these new pastures be? Well, WWE, as it turned out. That's right, after a few failed tryouts in 2005, 2008, and 2011, it looked like WWE were finally ready to take him on full-time. And this meant in May of 2013, he'd report to the WWE Performance Center where, after being rebranded as Slate Randall, he quickly got to work on establishing himself as a player. But alas, this wouldn't work out in the end either, as on August 1st, 2014, the Hagerstown boy would be released from his contract due to him not getting along with the training staff at the time. So, needing to bounce back quickly, Ricker returned to the Indies, where he found work at the likes of Full Impact Pro and the World Wrestling Council, all while he was also dipping his toes into the world of TV, with appearances on both Dwayne Johnson-hosted reality show The Hero and the Andy Samberg-led police comedy Brooklyn Nine-Nine. That said, for as much fun as he was having taking on scripted roles, it was always the ring which meant the most to him, and so, after continually looking for a spot in a more prominent company, eventually Shawn's luck turned when in February of 2015, he got an opportunity to participate in TNA's one-night-only Gut Check tournament, with him there scoring a victory over Crazy Steve. And thankfully, he'd impressed the right people enough here to where, 1 month later on the March 27th episode of Impact Wrestling, he'd be invited back again. But this wouldn't be in some undercard role. No, with him now taking on the new moniker of Eli Drake, it would be a fast rise to the top as the once WWE hopeful quickly joined forces with Drew Galloway and Micah to form The Rising, chief rivals to the Beatdown Clan. Yes, it was quite a step up for the boy from Maryland, and he took full advantage of the opportunity, because over a series of multi-man matches between the two stables across the months which followed, he'd regularly stand out as a star in waiting. And a large part of the reason for that was because, now with a televised audience watching him work, Drake was able to let his promo skills shine as he took up the mic at any opportunity and absolutely obliterated his opponents. So good would he be in this role, in fact, even after The Rising went their separate ways in July of that same year, the newest member of the roster managed to establish himself as a heel singles threat going forward with ease. And this led to him having a lengthy feud with his now former stablemate Galloway, a feud which saw the pair battle it out numerous times throughout the summer, with the final encounter at August 19th's Turning Point actually seeing the bad guy get the win. That's right, in a rare moment of a heel coming out on top in a major program, Eli Drake stood tall over the Scotsman, and using the momentum he'd gathered from this then, he'd spend the rest of the year further building his name by taking part in such tournaments as the Bound for Gold Gauntlet and the TNA World Title Series. Sadly though, he wouldn't win either of these in the end. No, his next big moment wouldn't come until January 26, 2016, at which point he won the Feast or Fired match and, in the process, earned himself a future shot at the TNA King of the Mountain Championship. Before he could cash this in though, the former Slate Randall first had to deal with another Scottish performer in fan favorite Grado. Why was Grado so upset? Well, after his own Feast or Fired briefcase led to him being given his pink slip, the Ayrshire native wanted revenge on the man who he felt held the title shot he deserved in the first place. And that led to a pair of bouts between the two throughout February and March, with the first seeing Grado get the win after disguising himself as the masked Odarg the Great, and the second seeing him once again get the better of his opponent during a ladder match where he'd actually put his career on the line beforehand. Yes, things suddenly weren't looking very good for Eli Drake, but at least he still had that title shot in his back pocket to be cashed in when he felt the time was right. And as it happened, the right time turned out to be the May 31st episode of Impact, as it was there he finally called his shot against then-champion Bram, with the heel at this point beating him to win his first title in TNA. Of course, now being a champion himself, it meant a target had suddenly been painted on Drake's back, and so if he wanted to remain on top, he'd have to fend off a whole host of challengers as the weeks and months went on. And of those challengers at this time, perhaps none were more prominent than James Storm, because once the Cowboy appeared on Eli's talk show Facts of Life and ended up laying him out with a last call, it ignited a deep hatred between the duo. So it should go without saying then, the subsequent in-ring showdown on the July 5th episode of Impact was a heated affair, one which saw the champ have to intentionally disqualify himself during a match in order to escape with his gold. But that wouldn't work for TNA management, and so, in the rematch a month later on August 4th, disqualification wouldn't be an option, and this time Storm would finally get both the win and the title he'd been looking for. That's right, after so much hard work and pushing himself to the top, Eli Drake was now without gold once more. Thankfully though, he wouldn't let this get him down for long, as soon thereafter, he'd enter into a tournament to crown the inaugural Impact Grand Champion, with him there going all the way to the semifinals before being beaten by Aaron Rex. And with this giving him some much needed confidence again, it made it easy for the Maryland native to not only enter the Bound for Glory gauntlet after that, but also go on to win after last eliminating Tyrus. Obviously then, with such a victory came a prize, and that prize was a shot at the TNA World Heavyweight title. Again though, before Drake was able to cash this in, he'd first have to deal with a new rival in the form of EC3, someone who wanted nothing more than to put the heel in his place after he'd listened to one too many of his promos. But by this point, there was no stopping the momentum the Bound for Glory Gauntlet winner has built up, and so he'd score an easy victory over Carter in a tag match on the October 27th episode of Impact. And once that was done, he'd begin preparing for his cash-in, a cash-in which took place a couple of weeks later on the November 10th episode of Impact. Unfortunately though, no matter how much momentum he had, in the end it wasn't enough for Drake to beat the then TNA World Heavyweight Champion Eddie Edwards. And as if that weren't bad enough, after rekindling his feud with Ethan Carter again following this, a subsequent loss on November 24th would see the former King of the Mountain champion be forced to silence himself for the remainder of the year. That's right, there would be no more promos, no more Facts of Life segments. So maybe it's a small blessing then that this muting of his voice wouldn't last for too long, because once 2017 came a couple of months later, the heel was able to pick up right where he left off by getting into a verbal showdown with the Hardy Boys, a showdown which led to him partnering up with Tyrus to take on the pair at January 6th, One Night Only live. And once that was over, the new partnership between the heel pair continued on for a while as they helped each other out in bouts throughout the rest of the winter and into the spring. Sadly though, this would not be enough to see Eli Drake win more singles gold quite yet, as despite he and his partner's best efforts, he'd fail in his attempts to beat Alberto El Patron in a GFW Global Championship #1 contenders bout on May 4th, just as he'd failed to beat the then Impact Grand Champion Moose on June 1st. But it wasn't like the bad times would last forever, because for someone as determined as the Hagerstown Boy, there was always going to be another opportunity just waiting over the horizon. And that opportunity happened on the August 24th episode of Impact that year, as there, after entering at number 2, Drake won a 20-man gauntlet match to crown himself the new GFW Global Champion after the belt had been vacated some time prior. Yes, there was finally gold back around the heel's waist, and this only further added to his cocky persona as the weeks went on. But then, he had every reason to be cocky, because with him successfully defending the belt, which would soon be merged with the Impact World Championship against the likes of Matt Sydal in America and Cody Hall in Japan, there was simply no doubt about who the best was. Even when he found himself being challenged by a particularly tricky opponent to deal with in Johnny Impact's Nitro, Mundo, Elite, Blaze, Fusion, Caballero, etc., it didn't matter, because once the bout between those two was over, it would be Drake standing tall, just as he would also stand tall when challenged by Alberto El Patron at November 5th's Bound for Glory. And 2018 carried on in much the same vein too, at least in the beginning anyway, as during a triple threat match between Eli, Alberto, and Johnny Everything Everywhere All at Once at January 25th's Genesis inside of a steel cage, the heel champion managed to retain again. That said, things wouldn't work out so well a week later on the February 1st episode of Impact, as there, after a title reign which had lasted for 146 days, the Impact World Champion finally fell to a less beaten down opponent in Austin Aries. So, now without a title once more, it was left to the former champ to build himself back up again, and this was something he started doing in March of that same year when he again won a Feast or Fired match, and this time earned a shot at the Impact World Tag Team titles. The only question left then was who would his partner be during this match? Well, as far as Eli Drake was concerned, no one, because now a solo act, he had no time for the tag team belts anymore. No, he was far more focused on pursuing the world title again, something he did when, on April 5th, he managed to defeat Moose for another briefcase, which granted him a future shot at the Impact World Championship. That said, what he hadn't counted on at this point was that a teammate would be about to present themselves, and when they did so, it would be someone the Maryland native couldn't turn down, as it was none other than Scott Steiner. That's right, Big Pump himself had thrown his hat in the ring when it came to winning the tag team titles with Drake. And so, with such a powerhouse by his side then, the holder of the briefcase decided to go for it, a decision which led to the pair defeating LAX at Redemption on April 22nd to take the gold away for themselves. But there was still another title one half of the new champions had on his mind on top of this, and his shot at that belt came just a few weeks later on the May 10th episode of Impact. Unfortunately though, Eli Drake would not be as lucky when he went up against the then world champion Pentagon Jr. here, as the Lucha Star proved to be just too much for him to overcome in the end. And as if that weren't bad enough, just 1 week after that, he'd lose his newly won tag team titles too, when he and Scott Steiner were beaten by the pairing of DJZ and Andrew Everett. Of course, this led to frustrations building between the now former champions then, frustrations which climaxed in a one-on-one match at May 31st Under Pressure, where Drake actually got the win after laying out his rival with a steel chair. Yes, ever the heel, the future WWE star was always happy to get a screwy victory if necessary, and this served him well in the end because following on from that, he'd returned to the world title scene when he and Moose began battling it out over the #1 contendership spot. Sure, it would be Moose who came out of this feud the winner, but that wasn't a complete disaster for his opponent, as now revitalized and ready to reach singles stardom once more, Drake reignited his old program with Grado when he started going after his on-screen girlfriend, Katarina. And when Grado brought in backup in the form of fellow Scotsman Joe Hendry then, it led to the heel finding a new family of his own when he briefly began aligning himself with Trevor Lee and Caleb Conley. But for as much fun as the subsequent matches turned out to be, it was clear the Hagerstown native was starting to spin his wheels at this point, as really, he'd done just about everything he could in Impact. So perhaps it was a blessing in disguise when, after spending the next few months locked in a feud with Abyss, Eli Drake would leave the company. As you can probably guess, however, it wouldn't take someone like the former Impact World Champion long to find a job elsewhere, as on June 28, 2019, he'd appear as the secret partner of Nick Aldis at the Ring of Honor event Best in the World. That said, it wouldn't actually be ROH he'd be working for going forward. No, it would be Aldis's full-time home, the NWA, a place which turned out to be perfect for Drake, as with its emphasis on old studio-style wrestling, it allowed him to have short burst matches and plenty of opportunity to cut promos in front of a small but highly engaged audience. And when he wasn't owning the mic, he was also finding success in the ring, such as the time he and James Storm paired up to briefly win the NWA Tag Team titles. Sadly though, as a result of the global shutdown hitting everyone hard in 2020, it meant many people would have to be cut from the NWA, and this meant Eli Drake was finally able to move back over to WWE when he signed on the dotted line on February 14th, 2021. Sure, he may have been older than your average signing at this point, as he was by now 38 years old, and with NXT about to morph into NXT 2.0, complete with a push for younger stars, it left his future unclear. But even if the odds were stacked against him, the former Impact star always had an ace in the hole to help get him over, and that was his abilities on the mic. So understanding this, he took every opportunity he could to speak to fans over the next few weeks. And so good was he at doing this, he was successful in getting fans invested. So much so that after almost becoming #1 contender to the North American Championship at April 7th's TakeOver Stand and Deliver, he'd catch the attention of Ted DiBiase. Of course, the man with the gift of gab had no need for a mouthpiece though, and that was why once he was able to use DiBiase to help him beat Cameron Grimes at June 13th's TakeOver In Your House for the newly reintroduced $1 Million title, he kicked his would-be manager to the curb. Yes, LA Knight was purely in it for himself, and despite his heel demeanor, this rebel attitude even led to some fans starting to get behind him at this point, which was exactly why, before the year was out, he'd turn face and be moved up to the main event scene, where he began feuding with the likes of Grayson Waller, Joe Gacy, and even the mighty Gunther. So really, it should come as no surprise, plans were now being put in place to formally move him up to the main roster. The only problem with that was that rather than let Knight appear on SmackDown with a gimmick that was already working, he'd instead be given the new role of Max Dupree, the brand manager of Maximum Male Models. Yes, it was a very mid-card comedy gimmick which was far below the heights the former $1 Million champion could achieve. So thankfully, once Triple H took over creative in 2022, one of his first moves was to turn Max Dupree back into LA Knight again. Thank God he did this then, because at that point Knight would slowly begin building momentum amongst fans, enough to the point where after a brief feud with Ricochet helped to re-establish him to the WWE audience, he'd be picked to be the first man to take on Bray Wyatt following his return to the Fed in late 2022. And with that match, the one which took place at the 2023 Royal Rumble, ending up being Wyatt's final in-ring showing before he tragically passed away later the same year, it's given the moment even more historical significance in the time since. But that was far from the only notable moment the Maryland native would be involved in into his 2023 carried on. No, with him only continuing to get more and more over as the weeks went on, there came a point where fans started demanding he be pushed into a more prominent main event spot. So when it came time for Money in the Bank on July 1st of that year, it seemed like he was a heavy favorite to end up winning the whole thing, and from there go on to cash in his contract at a future time of his choosing, and in the process, win a world title. Would he do this? No. Sadly, LA Knight would have to watch on instead, as by the time the Money in the Bank ladder match was over, it would be Damian Priest who was standing tall instead. But this wouldn't keep the increasing cult favorite down for long. After all, fans were behind him more than ever now, and were even more desperate to see him succeed than they had been previously. So he knew he had to keep pushing on for them, if nothing else. And that's exactly what led him to bounce back at SummerSlam on August 5th when he won the Slim Jim Battle Royal after last eliminating Sheamus. So now that he was back on track, Knight was able to refocus his energy on reaching the top of the card, with this being something he made major steps towards over the course of the autumn when he entered into a feud with The Miz. And once that feud was over, he'd find himself in a very advantageous career position when he teamed up with John Cena to take on Jimmy Uso and Solo Sikoa of the Bloodline at October 8th's Fastlane PLE. How would this match go for him? Very well, as it happened, because he and Big Match John would get the win by the time all was said and done. And that would set him up nicely for a shot at the champ in November. That's right, after falling into the Bloodline's radar, LA Knight's next target would be Roman Reigns and the undisputed WWE Universal title he carried around his waist. But obviously a match as big as this couldn't happen on a random old episode of television. No, it needed a special event, and that would end up being Crown Jewel on November 4th. Sure, given how long Roman's title reign had been going on by this point, and given it was clear Cody Rhodes was still his endgame, very few had any hope of the challenger walking out of this one with the belt. But that didn't mean he couldn't still be elevated to that next level by hanging with the champ in a main event spot, and luckily for him, that's exactly what he did when the two finally locked horns and put on a main event worthy of a PLE. So good of a performance would he give here, in fact, that in January of 2024 at the Royal Rumble, he'd get another shot at the gold when he was part of a fatal four-way bout for the top prize, a bout which also included Randy Orton and AJ Styles. And while LA Knight would once again walk out of this one the loser, he at least didn't eat the pinfall. No, that would be Styles who did this. So because of that, the fan favorite would remain strong in the audience's eyes as they continued to will him on towards title success. Really, at this point, it was just a case of when were WWE finally going to pull the trigger on giving the Maryland native a run with a belt, and when they did, what belt was it going to be? Given how tied up the undisputed WWE Universal title was at that point in time, it didn't seem likely he'd be getting any more shots at that one in the immediate future. And with him being on SmackDown, that also ruled out shots at the World Heavyweight and Intercontinental titles too. Luckily though, there was another prize that was available to him, namely the United States Championship, a prize then being held by Logan Paul. So seeing this as perhaps his final opportunity to win a title in WWE, Knight started pursuing this belt after defeating AJ Styles at WrestleMania 40. Before he'd get the shot at Paul though, the fan favorite would first have to win a tournament in order to earn it. And that tournament began for him on the April 12th episode of SmackDown. But while he would make it through this first round into the semis here, in the end his dreams of winning the tournament and challenging the champ were cut short when, in a rematch from WrestleMania 40, he failed to defeat the Phenomenal One. Did this mean it was well and truly over for Knight? Well, no, because while he would miss out on this title shot, come the summer he'd find himself back in the chase, and that all led to him finally getting his shot at the belt at SummerSlam on August 3rd. Yes, this was the moment everyone had been waiting for from the Hagerstown boy, the moment that a 2-decade-long career had all been building up to. So thank God he rose to the occasion then, because at SummerSlam, in a bout which lasted for 12 minutes on the dot, he finally ended the reign of terror and took the US title home for himself. What's he been doing since then? Well, like any true fighting champion, he's been defending his strap against all comers, whether it be Andrade, Carmelo Hayes, or anyone else who feels they can step up to him. And that's something that continues to this day. How long will he be able to hold on to this belt now that he's the man in possession of it at last? We'll just have to wait and see. But one thing is for sure, and that's going forward, WWE is now LA Knight Country, and that's just a fact of life. Yeah! Years, fans have been on the lookout for a modern-day version of Kurt Angle, someone who has the legitimate wrestling skills that the Olympic gold medalist had, all while being as versatile of a character as he was. Of course, after a long time of searching though, it felt like this person might never come around. But in recent years, Chad Gable has risen to the forefront. Yes, with his ability to go in the ring, as well as being able to take just about any gimmick and make it work, he's proved to be one of the very best in the world. But how did he get to this point? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into his entire career journey so far in American Alpha, the Chad Gable story. Charles Edward Betts was born on March 8, 1986 in St. Michael, Minnesota, and it was there that he grew up very interested in athletics, particularly amateur wrestling. Such a big interest would he take in this field, in fact, by the time he was graduating high school in 2004, he'd be a Minnesota high school state champion when it came to grappling. So at this point, it only made sense for him to continue pursuing amateur wrestling as he entered further studies at Northern Michigan University, with it being there that under the tutelage of Dan Chandler and Greg Greeno, he'd continue to develop his already impressive skills to the point that by the time the 2010s dawned, he'd be an Olympic hopeful. Yes, come 2011, Charles was on the verge of qualifying for the US team at the 2012 Summer Olympics. And that wasn't the only big life event happening for him here, as while spending almost every waking hour training as hard as he could, he was also finding the time to get married to his childhood sweetheart, Christy Oliver, on June 19th of the former year. Still though, for as exciting as this new personal life situation was, the Minnesotan couldn't let it take his attention away from his professional goal, a goal which he eventually realized when he went to London the following year and ended up reaching the second round in the Greco-Roman style event. Was it disappointing to the future tag team champion that he never managed to win any medals while he was at the Olympics? Sure, we've no doubt it had to be for a man who's as driven as him. But at least he got to represent his country on about as grand a stage as he could. Once that was over though, he found himself looking for a new career to pursue, a career which would eventually lead him to the Squared Circle in November of 2013. This was when Betts was signed to a developmental contract with WWE. Yes, that company had first gained interest in the rookie after seeing what he'd done in London. And while being a good amateur wrestler doesn't necessarily mean you'll be worth watching as a pro, Charles quickly proved to be something of a prodigy inside the ring, just as Vince McMahon had hoped he would. So good was he, in fact, come September of 2014, after less than 1 year of being trained inside the Performance Center, the now renamed Chad Gable would be making his initial appearances at NXT house shows around Florida. How would he do during these matches? Pretty good as it happened, and that all led to him making his TV debut on January 8th, 2015, where he lost to Tyler Breeze. That said, a loss was not exactly a setback for him here. No, Chad was already proving to his bosses with this first performance that he was someone to be watched. Really, it all just came down to what role the company was going to slot him in going forward. And this would become more apparent by the time the spring rolled around, as that was the point Triple H decided to pair him up with Jason Jordan as a tag team act. That's right, this was the birth of American Alpha, a duo whose gimmick was that they were two very legit wrestlers who could run circles around any of their opponents in the ring. Needless to say then, once Gable was, in storyline, able to convince Jordan to start working alongside him following the collapse of the latter's partnership with Ty Dillinger, they'd become an instant success. Seriously, after only a few weeks together, they'd already be beating teams such as Adrian Neville and Solomon Crow and the Hype Bros, with this quickly setting them up as one of the primary acts of the tag team division down on the Black and Gold brand, right when that division was about to enter into something of a golden era. Why was this such a golden era for tag team wrestling down in NXT? Well, aside from it being the introduction of American Alpha, it was also the point that other duos such as DIY and The Revival were beginning to get going as well. And with all three of these teams being amongst the top tier of workers on the brand, it meant that any combination of them we got over the months and years which followed would almost always be excellent. Of course, the excellent work rate on display here also had an unintended effect, and that was to turn American Alpha babyface, as despite them initially being presented as heels, their fighting spirit, in-ring style quickly got fans on their sides, way too much for them to be booed. No, by the time 2016 came around, Chad Gable and Jason Jordan were far too over to have anyone hate them. So when they challenged the Revival for the NXT Tag Team titles at TakeOver Dallas on April 1st of that year, the live crowd in attendance would be fully behind their efforts. And this was enough for them to go all the way because once this match was over, the babyface duo would have won their first set of gold in the WWE system. Where would they go from here? Well, they'd defend the belts against all comers, though that run wouldn't last for long as it turned out, because at TakeOver The End just 2 months later, they'd find themselves dropping the titles back to Dash and Dawson. Yes, it was a tough setback for the rookies, but it wasn't enough to keep them down for long. And that was because after losing an excellent 2 out of 3 falls rubber match to the Revival and then working a short program with the Authors of Pain, American Alpha would be called up to the main roster. That's right, it was on July 19th of 2016 that the two became official members of the SmackDown brand. And this saw them quickly be thrown into the deep end during feuds against the likes of the Vaudevillains, Breezango, and the Ascension, as each team gave their best efforts to become the inaugural tag team champions of that show. Unfortunately though, despite picking up some early wins here, Gable and Jordan would not become the first SmackDown tag team champions. No, that honor would go to Rhino and Heath Slater instead, with American Alpha having a program with the Usos instead. And after losing that feud, the pair would begin a difficult time on the main roster. Yes, this wasn't NXT anymore, and soon they became background players at various points over the next few months. Sure, they would be able to put on good performances whenever they were given the chance, but those chances were so few and far between for Chad and Jason now. Thankfully though, they were given a chance toward the end of 2016, as this was the point that they'd win a 4-way tag team bout on the December 27th episode of SmackDown to become that brand's tag team champions. However, at this time, the main roster tag division simply wasn't on the same level as the NXT division, so it was at WrestleMania 33, instead of defending their gold in a match on the show, both Chad Gable and Jason Jordan would find themselves playing the role of warm bodies in the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal, a far cry from the way they'd been treated when they were down on the black and gold brand, being given time to tear it up on a regular basis. What they needed then was to change that up, and that change-up would come in the form of a split. That's right, in June of that year, the two-time tag team champions would part ways in a remarkably amicable manner, considering this was wrestling. What would they each do now that they were flying solo? Well, while Jason Jordan would head over to Raw to be revealed as Kurt Angle's illegitimate son, Chad Gable would remain on the blue brand and make an early splash by challenging Kevin Owens for the United States title. Sure, he'd lose this match, but even in losing, the Minnesotan had been able to prove that he had it in him to be a single star. Unluckily for him, though, his bosses at the time would apparently not see this as a long-term direction for him at that time. No, by the point August came around, Chad would be in a tag team all over again, this time with Shelton Benjamin. And while this team was fun to watch, with it feeling like a collision of past and present on account of American Alpha very much being a more updated modern version of the world's greatest tag team from the early to mid-2000s, it still seemed to many like Gable was spinning his wheels here, and that a lot more could have been getting done with him. But alas, things were what they were, and so, trying to make the best of the situation, the Olympic athlete powered on, partnering up with the Gold Standard over the months which followed to pick up wins over teams such as the Ascension, the Hype Bros, and the Usos. That said, when they finally did beat the team of Jimmy and Jay, it would only be via countout, meaning the Usos kept hold of their SmackDown tag team titles. And frustration over this was part of the reason the babyface duo turned heel around that time, with this being the first time Gable had played a heel since back during his early run on NXT. Would that be something which took him a while to get used to again? Sure, but it didn't take too long. No, come January of 2018, Gable would be racking up win after win with his partner, with this all leading up to the two getting multiple further shots at the gold. Even then though, no matter how many chances they got, Chad and Shelton just couldn't take the belts away from the Usos. So fans were pleased when, as part of the 2018 Superstar Shakeup in April of that year, Gable and Benjamin's team was dissolved on account of the former being moved to Raw. And once there, after standing up for the honor of the Red Brand's general manager at the time, Kurt Angle, Chad would turn babyface again. Still though, despite looking good during an early singles match against Jinder Mahal, any hopes of him getting a sustained solo run were cut short when, mere months later, the fan favorite would be put into another tag team, this time with Bobby Roode. Of course, for as much as this wasn't what most fans wanted at the time though, there were good things to be taken from the pairing, mostly on account of both men throwing themselves into the whole thing at the point that Gable even began coming out to the ring wearing a robe so that he could feel more connected to his new tag team partner. and that unity would eventually see the pair find success together, as it was on December 10th of that year that they beat the Authors of Pain to become Raw Tag Team Champions. Obviously then, aside from another set of titles to add to his trophy cabinet, this also gave the Minnesotan the rare honor of being able to say he'd won the top prize in the tag team division of all three brands under the WWE banner during the mid to late 2010s. Hell, at this point in time, he was only the second man to ever achieve such a feat, with the first being his former American Alpha teammate Jason Jordan. That said, while this was certainly impressive and while it did a lot to boost Chad's reputation with fans, it wasn't enough to get him out of that mid-card purgatory he seemed to be locked in forever by now. No, even if he was a champion once more, he'd still find himself often working in forgettable matches like at the Royal Rumble in 2019, when, rather than appearing on the main show, he and Bobby Roode were relegated to wrestling on the pre-show against the makeshift duo of Razor and Scott Dawson. And it would only be a few weeks after this, on the February 11th episode of Raw that year, that Gable and Roode lost their tag team titles to the Revival. And this would eventually lead to the pair splitting in the spring of 2019, with Chad going on to get rebranded with an all-new gimmick. Yes, this was the debut of Shorty G, a gimmick which played off the idea that as a 5'8" tall man, he was not exactly the biggest guy on the roster. Obviously then, such a character could have been a burial for many wrestlers, but Chad was able to make the most of it as he finally managed to carve out some TV time as a real singles act. And his subsequent feud with Baron Corbin, a feud which climaxed at Hell in a Cell on October 6, 2019, allowed him to show more of what he could do in the ring. What would Shorty G do after that program was over? He'd continue to plug away in the ring, hoping for an opportunity to arise where he could break out of the pack. And that saw him enter into rivalries with the likes of Sheamus and Matt Riddle. Thankfully then, this eventually led to a situation where it became clear to Vince McMahon that this gimmick wasn't working in making the Olympian feel like a bigger star. And so that was why in October of 2020, after losing a match to Lars Sullivan, Shorty G announced that he was dropping the whole thing and was going back to being plain old Chad Gable. Of course, this was more than just a name change, however, as there would also be a general refresh of Gable's direction on the show going forward, with him at this point aligning himself with his real-life close friend Otis. And while that saw Chad be returned to the tag team division again, it was a real positive for his career this time. Why was that? Well, over the months which followed, the Chad Gable and Otis partnership would become one of the most over things in WWE, as their chemistry together turned them into a hit with fans watching at home. Sure, there were no fans cheering them on in arenas here, but that's because at this point there were no fans in arenas at all. Yes, the state of the world in 2020 meant this was not possible. That said, it also meant Gable had a lot more free time to better himself outside of the ring. So that's what he did, with him eventually earning a master's degree in media design from Full Sail University in October of 2021. Meanwhile, as this was happening in his personal life, back in the ring, Chad had turned heel once more after he and Otis laid out Rey Mysterio on the February 19th, 2021 episode of SmackDown. Not that they'd remain on the blue brand for long following this though. No, by the time the summer came around, they'd have been moved over to Raw, and that's where the pair remained throughout 2022 as, come January of that year, the team now known as Alpha Academy were defeating Arcade Bro to win the Raw Tag Team Championship. That's right, the St. Michael native now had the rare honor of being not only able to say that he'd been a tag team champion on every brand in WWE, but that he'd been a tag team champion with 3 separate partners. And this was an accolade which could never be taken away from him as time went on, even after Alpha Academy dropped the belts back to Randy Orton and Matt Riddle just 55 days later. No, by now Chad Gable was very much seen by fans as someone who was consistently one of the best workers on the roster. The only thing he needed now was to take his character to the next level. And this would happen as the spring of 2022 dawned, because it was then that the former American Alpha members began shooshing people during segments and showing people more of his personality. So much would this work, in fact, it would at points almost turn him babyface with audiences again. But Chad would need this audience support as it happened, because from March onwards, the diminutive star would enter into a bit of a rivalry with Maxine Dupree as she continually tried to steal Otis away to her Maximum Male Models stable. All well, at the same time, Chad kept attempting to rein his friend back and keep him on his side instead. What would the end result of this competition over Otis's services be? Well, surprisingly enough, it would be Maxine leaving Maximum Male Models and joining up with the Alpha Academy. And that would lead to the group formally turning babyface again soon thereafter. Really, it felt like they'd found that missing piece of the puzzle at this point, the one they needed in order to get to the next level. So when their next challengers, the Viking Raiders, presented themselves, the trio of Gable, Otis, and Dupree were able to stand tall come the end. Still though, even if things were going well in the tag division again, Chad Gable continued to have ambitions of being a solo star one day. And this was why, as the summer came around, he'd begin setting his sights on that goal once more. How would he do this? Well, by going after then Intercontinental Champion Gunther. Sadly though, despite besting the Austrian on the August 21st, 2023 episode of Raw, this victory would come as a result of a countout, and for that reason, the heel retained the title. Sure, Gable would get a rematch as a result of his victory here, but try as he might, he just couldn't win that rematch. And for a while at least, it felt like it might be leading to a rubber match where the tag team specialists would finally win the IC title, but in the end, this was not what happened. Rather, in the lead up to WrestleMania 40, Chad would play the Mickey to Sami Zayn's Rocky instead, as he helped to motivate him to go on to be the one to finally dethrone Gunther at that show. Needless to say then, because he'd helped Sami to achieve his goal, the Alpha Academy member felt like he was deserving of being the first one to challenge the new champ after he'd won, with this being something he did on the April 15th, 2024 episode of Raw. Sadly though, this would all end in yet another loss for Gable. So in his frustration, he'd snap here, attacking Zayn while he was celebrating with his wife at ringside, and in the process turning heel all over again. Yes, this was the breaking point for the technical maestro, with him deciding that he was no longer interested in being affiliated with Sami Zayn. No, going forward, he was going to focus on his own goals, and that meant getting the Intercontinental title he so craved. Unfortunately, however, despite getting multiple further attempts to best the champ in the months which followed, Gable would be unable to do so, partially because his stablemates Otis and Maxine Dupree and their newest recruit Akira Tozawa refused to go along with his heelish ways and turned to the dark side themselves. So bad would the tension get between Alpha Academy after a while, Otis, Dupree, and Tozawa would all walk out on their leader. And this proved to be terrible timing for him because on the very night that happened, Gable would be laid out by the Wyatt Six during their debut. As you would expect then, this experience left the heel shaken up and eager to reassess the direction he'd been going with his life. Hell, it was this attack which led to him trying to win the favor of Alpha Academy back over the weeks which followed, all while he was continuing to be stalked by Uncle Howdy and his crew. But it would not be Alpha Academy who eventually stood by his side against the Wyatt Six. No, it would be in the summer of 2024 that Chad Gable, sick of being hounded by Uncle Howdy, called Bo Dallas out to the ring. And at that point, he'd reveal his new muscle to the world, the Creed brothers. That's right, the heel's involvement in Alpha Academy was over, and now he had a new stable around him, one going by the name of American Made. And after their feud with the Wyatt Six ended, Gable would move on into a rivalry with WWE's newest signing, Penta, with Chad being unable to defeat the Lucha Star. But while things might have looked like they were sliding for the Olympian again here, he would be given a lifeline when, in the weeks which followed, he began a new storyline, one in which, in order to get revenge on Penta, he went on a spirit quest to discover the ways of Lucha Libre. And this would all lead to him returning soon thereafter under a mask as El Grande Americano. Of course, Chad denies to this day that he's behind the mask. Regardless of what is true though, both Chad Gable and El Grande Americano continue to tear it up on a weekly basis on Raw, and it finally feels like Chad is on his way to a singles title in the near future. Hell, El Grande Americano was even able to get a win over Rey Fenix at WrestleMania 41 Night 1 on April 19th, 2025. And even if it's not a major one, he has won a belt in WWE recently, as it was in May of this year that he'd defeat Dragon Lee to obtain the Twitter-only title, the men's Speed title. Where does he go from here? We'll have to wait and see, as the world is his oyster. And that means we've likely got many more years of Chad Gable left ahead of us, years in which he'll continue to show us all exactly what makes him an American Alpha. Comedy can be hard to pull off in wrestling, but in recent years, one performer has really been able to crack the code by giving us some truly funny moments, and in the process, turning herself into a cult sensation. But of course, WWE's resident Karen's career goes a lot further than just her comedy antics. No, she's also a well-seasoned all-rounder in the world of wrestling. But how did she get to this point? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into her entire career journey so far in Hot Mess, the Chelsea Green story. Chelsea Ann Green was born on April 4th, 1991 in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, and it was there that she developed an interest in wrestling. In fact, she found something of an idol in WWE star Kelly Kelly during her teen years, with it being the former Divas champion who inspired Green to become a wrestler herself. So it was that, after graduating school, Chelsea decided to start training in the ways of the ring, and this soon led to her finding work on her local Canadian indie circuit, where she'd go under the original ring name of Jada. What were some of the places Jada honed her craft after having her first match in 2014? Well, Elite Canadian Championship Wrestling for one. And so impressive would she be there, she'd soon catch the eye of WWE, with this being exactly why she'd be brought in to do a cameo performance on the August 11th, 2014 episode of Raw, where she'd play a physical therapist named Megan Miller. Who was Megan Miller exactly? Well, she was the woman that the Authority had paid off to claim she was having an affair with Daniel Bryan. Needless to say then, this was only a short-lived role, but it would be enough to earn Green some notice backstage, and that led to her being selected as a contestant for Season 6 of the relaunched version of Tough Enough in 2015. How would Chelsea do on this show? Pretty well, as it happened. In fact, she'd make it all the way to the Final Four on the female side of the equation. That said, this would not be enough to earn her a contract with the company quite yet. No, for now, she'd have to return to the indie circuit, waiting for that next big opportunity to come along. Luckily for her, though, that opportunity was going to come sooner than she realized, because after taking note of her work, Rossy Agawa, founder and then booker of World Wonder Ring Stardom, the #1 all-women's wrestling promotion in the world, decided she was exactly what he was looking for. So it was then that in 2016, just 2 years into her career, Green would then get to do a tour with Stardom. Unfortunately for her, though, this would have to be cut short when she broke her collarbone during a match, putting her on the injury shelf for a while. Not that this would be the end of her time in Stardom for good, though. No, once she healed up, the Canadian would be invited back again, and it would be here that she'd finally get to properly mix it up with some of the best female talent out there. And come 2017, she'd return to America with a lot more experience, this time to wrestle for Queen of Combat. That's right, this was not the same Chelsea Green who had been in her home continent before. No, now she was ready to win some gold. And some gold is what she would soon win when, on February 18th of that year, she teamed with Taylor Hendricks to become the inaugural QOC Tag Team Champions. And this was far from all she was doing stateside by now, because by that point she'd also managed to score a job with TNA. Yes, now going by the ring name of Laurel Van Ness, the British Columbian was fast rising up the ranks of the Knockouts division as well. But then it was hard for her not to be a fast riser at this point, as the character she'd created for herself in TNA was an instant winner and one which perfectly played into her comedic talents. What did it involve exactly? Well, it involved her presenting herself as the Hot Mess, a maniacal girl who constantly looked like she'd just come back from 4 nights of non-stop partying after having been left at the altar by her kayfabe fiancé, Braxton Sutter. That's right, after her on-screen lover dumped her for Allie, Laurel Van Ness apparently lost her mind and gave up on ever changing her clothes, which was exactly why she was now always adorned in a torn-up wedding dress with messy, disheveled hair and makeup, usually with a half-empty wine bottle in her hand to boot. Obviously then, it's easy to see why fans took to this gimmick, as it was so out there and so fun to watch. And it allowed Chelsea to get a lot of extra screen time she likely wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Hell, so much screen time would she get now, she'd regularly find herself in matches against the likes of Madison Rayne, Allie, and Rosemary, all while, in segments surrounding her bouts, her new kayfabe single status would see her getting courted by people such as Scottish star Grado. Of course, in reality, however, Green was far from single. No, by this point, she'd begun dating Matt Cardona, and that would later blossom into marriage. Before this happened, however, Van Ness would turn babyface for the first time in the Impact Zone when, on the August 24th, 2017 episode of Impact, she'd come out to the ring, now all cleaned up for the first time in months, all with the intention of finally accepting Grado's advances. In fact, she wasn't just ready to date Grado, no, she was ready to marry him, and this was why she went as far as to propose here. Sadly for her, though, while Grado would initially accept this proposal, once he found out she was Canadian and as a result would not be able to get him an American green card through marriage, he called the whole thing off, leading to Laurel losing her mind all over again and reverting back to being the hot mess fans had by then come to know and love her as. That said, despite fans' fondness of her antics by now, Van Ness would technically be the heel in this situation. and this meant when she screwed Grado out of a victory during a Monsters Ball match at that November's Bound for Glory pay-per-view, it was positioned as a villainous move. And this also meant that when she went on to enter a tournament for the then vacant Knockouts Championship, she'd usually be put up against babyfaces on her side of the bracket. Not that such a thing would slow her down, however. No, by the time all was said and done, it would be the Canadian holding up the Knockouts title for her own after she beat Rosemary in the finals. And after that, now a singles champ for the first time in her career, Laurel would go on to defend her newly won gold against opponents such as Kiera Hogan. Interestingly though, while becoming a champion would usually be seen as a positive for someone's career, this presented something of a problem for Green because, prior to winning it, she was intending to request her release from TNA, as she believed WWE were interested in signing her up to a contract. Now that she was a champion, however, TNA bosses did not want to let her go, and this meant any WWE debut would have to be delayed as she first completed her time there, with this all finishing with her dropping the gold to Allie on January 15, 2018. That said, it wouldn't be straight to WWE at this point. No, there would still be a few more months delay before they would bring her in. Luckily for Chelsea though, this would give her ample time to further build up a reputation for herself as a talent to watch by not only appearing in Season 4 of Lucha Underground under the name of Reclusa, but also by showing up at the first All-In event in September of that year, where she was part of a four-way bout between Britt Baker, Madison Rayne, and Tessa Blanchard. After that though, it would be WWE all the way. Yes, following an official tryout in August, Green would be signed up to a contract and brought into the Performance Center in October to start learning the style. And this was something she apparently took to like a duck to water because by the end of that month, she'd be appearing at live NXT events, now under her real name once more, though regaining the hot mess character of Laurel Van Ness. But alas, if she thought this was going to be her big breakthrough moment, she was wrong, because as it happened, fate had other plans. And those plans involved her breaking her wrist during her first TV match in March of 2019, something which put her on the shelf for the next 3 months. Obviously then, when she finally returned in June, much of her steam had been lost, and this meant she'd do little of note for the rest of the year, with the only real thing she did throughout the remainder of 2019 in fact being a cameo appearance on an episode of Raw, where she did a job to Charlotte Flair. Still, there was always 2020, a year that, as it was beginning, Chelsea hoped was going to represent the real start of her WWE career. As we would all soon find out, however, 2020 would end up being one of the worst years in recorded history for everyone, and this would be no less true for Green, because after starting out strong by appearing in the Women's Royal Rumble match on January 26th, and then following that up by beating Shotzi Blackheart on the March 4th episode of Raw to earn herself a spot in a ladder match to determine the #1 contendership of the NXT Women's title, things would start to fall apart for the Canadian. That's right, just as the world was crumbling, Chelsea Green would see any creative plans that were being made for her fall apart when mass furloughing and firings at the WWE offices happened. Hell, prior to this, one of the plans for her had been for her to be called up to Raw, but instead, she'd have to sit on the sidelines again for a while, waiting all the way until November of that year before she was finally given another opportunity to appear on TV, this time as part of the SmackDown roster. Sadly though, this would not lead to another big breakout moment for the former Knockouts champion. No, instead, fate would play cruel tricks on her once more, as while taking part in a fatal four-way match with Liv Morgan, Natalya, and Tamina on the November 13th episode of The Blue Brand, Chelsea would break her wrist again, with this necessitating the planned finish of her coming out victorious having to be changed on the fly, as she instead lost to Morgan. And this all sadly led to April 15th, 2021, where after months of inactivity, she'd be released from her contract as part of another wave of releases. Still, while this was bad news, it wasn't all negative for Chelsea, because after a few months, she'd join Ring of Honor. That's right, it was on July 11th of this year that she made a surprise appearance at ROH's Best in the World pay-per-view as a commentator. And the reason she was only a commentator here and not in the ring was because, even this many months on, she still hadn't been cleared by doctors to return to the ring yet. No, that wouldn't happen until a week later on July 17th when she made her triumphant return to TNA, albeit now under her real name. What would she do in the Impact Zone this time around? Well, she'd start out by doing an intergender tag team match with her by then fiancé Matt Cardona, as the pair took on and defeated both Brian Myers and Tennille Dashwood. And after that was over, Green would continue to make a splash by entering into a tournament to become the inaugural digital media champion. Unfortunately for her though, despite making it all the way to the finals of this singles tournament. In the end, Chelsea would fall to the might of Jordynne Grace, as she instead took the title away for herself. Still, even if she wasn't a champion, things were still looking up for the girl from Victoria, as on New Year's Eve 2021, she and Matt Cardona would finally tie the knot in a ceremony held in Las Vegas. And now that she was a married woman, she was ready to make 2022 her year, as she vowed to rule the roost in TNA. How would she go about doing this? Well, she'd start by entering the Knockouts Ultimate X match at January 8th's Hard to Kill pay-per-view. And while she wouldn't win this, her performance would be enough to remind people why she was one of the top prospects in that division. And this wouldn't be all Chelsea was doing to make a name for herself at that time. No, she'd also refresh her character again when, along with her new husband, she'd turn heel on the March 24th episode of Impact by laying out Mickie James. And after that, she'd add even more associates to her ranks when she aligned herself with her real-life best friend Deonna Purrazzo, as the two became known as Vexed. How would Vexed fare as a duo? Pretty well, as it happened, because on the July 21st episode of Impact, in their first official match together, they'd be able to make short work of Jordynne Grace and Mia Yim. And following that, they'd keep the momentum going by not only challenging, but defeating Rosemary and Taya Valkyrie to become the Knockouts World Tag Team Champions. Sure, they would lose those titles to the Death Dolls just 1 month later, so it wouldn't exactly be a long reign or anything, but the only reason this had happened was because Chelsea was about to journey on towards ventures new once more. Yes, despite her last run in WWE not going to plan, by 2023 she would be brought back into the fold. So it was then that, after doing the honors to Mickie James on the November 11th, 2022 episode of Impact, Green would say her goodbyes to that promotion and would ready herself to return to WWE. How would her run in the WWE go this time around? Great, thankfully, as on January 28th, 2023, she'd make an immediate splash by entering the Women's Royal Rumble match. Sure, she may have been eliminated very quickly here by Rhea Ripley. Hell, she only lasted for 5 seconds before she was sent packing, in fact, but this wasn't a burial of her. Rather, it was a way of introducing her new character, that of WWE's resident Karen. That's right, no longer was Chelsea Green a hot mess. Now she was somebody whose favorite thing to do in the world was speak to the manager. And this new role, a largely comedic one, will allow her to bring the laughs over the months which followed. Of course, as with most comedy characters though, the expectation was that this one would have a relatively short shelf life. But so good was she in the role, she was able to give it more legs than anyone else could have. And this became evident early on when, despite often being put in positions seemingly set up for her to fail, Chelsea would succeed. No, this wouldn't lead to fans gravitating toward her right away. In fact, during her early months, when she was teaming up with Sonya Deville to do things like challenge for the WWE Women's Tag Team titles at WrestleMania 39, few in the audience paid her much mind at all. But by the time the summer of 2023 came around, people were forced to start taking notice of her, as that was when, following them being drafted over to Raw, Green and Deville would earn another shot at the gold, and this time when they challenged the champions, Liv Morgan and Raquel Rodriguez, on the July 17th episode of Raw, they'd win that gold, with this adding yet another accolade to the ever-growing list of Chelsea. And Chelsea Green gave these belts a whole new boost of life during her run with them, not because she was presented as a world beater or anything, but because she used all of her talents to make the segments which involved them entertaining. Even when a spanner got thrown in the works of the title run when Sonya Deville suffered a legitimate ACL tear early on into it, Green would make it work by demanding to Raw General Manager Adam Pearce, in her typical Karen manner, that she be able to hold on to both belts by herself. And when this request was refused, she then set about finding a new tag team partner, something which eventually she found, or which found her, to be more precise, when another Scottish performer entered her orbit. That's right, this was the point that an unlikely alliance formed between Chelsea Green and Piper Niven. And while it may have seemed like a weird mix to have these two work together at first, it came across great on TV. But it wouldn't just be tag team action that the Canadian would be taking part in by then. No, as the autumn of 2023 rolled around and WWE finally started to recognize what they had in her as a female Santino Marella of sorts, she was given more and more singles bouts, with one of the most notable of these being her trick or street fight against Natalya on the October 30th episode of Raw, where her Halloween costume for the evening was of fellow Canadian legend Bret Hitman Hart. Yes, it's true that when she took part in these singles matches, Chelsea was usually on the losing end of things, as that was still her role, even if she was starting to get more over by the week. But the wins would come for her in the tag team division anyway, the division where she still held the top gold with Piper Niven, so it wasn't as if she was too upset about this. That was until the December 18th, 2023 episode of Raw came around, and in what was the worst Christmas present possible for her, Green would team up with Niven to take on the challenge of Kaden Carter and Katana Chance, with it being here that Carter and Chance defeated the heels and took away their tag team titles from them, ending their reign at 126 days. How would Chelsea bounce back from this as 2024 began? Well, she'd start out by demanding a rematch against the new champions on the January 8th episode of Raw, but when this rematch saw her and Piper Niven fail to regain the titles, it was clear she was going to have to move on to a whole new venture. Yes, the Victoria native would head into the 2024 Women's Royal Rumble ready to prove to the world just how good she was by winning the whole thing. Unfortunately though, her attempts to win the Rumble didn't go so well. No, while she would last for a full 17 minutes here, a much better showing than her previous 5-second run in 2023, in the end, Chelsea would find herself being thrown over the top rope by Becky Lynch and forced to watch as someone else gained that ever-elusive WrestleMania World title shot. That said, the main roster wasn't the only place which had world titles. No, there was also NXT, and so this was why, after being drafted back over to SmackDown a couple of months later, Green would use the period that the draft window was open to make a quick pit stop down on the developmental brand. And while there, she'd be sure to stake her claim to the gold by challenging then NXT Women's Champion Roxanne Perez. Sadly, however, the prodigy would prove to be too much for the heel when the two finally met in the ring one-on-one during the May 7th episode of NXT. So, forced to try and bounce back again, Chelsea would return to the main roster where she called her shot and entered herself into the Women's Money in the Bank ladder match at the titular PLE on July 6th. And while she wouldn't win this one, the crowd reaction she got that night in her home country of Canada, despite still being a heel, was a sign of just how much of a cult following she'd gained by this point, all on account of how entertaining she was with any material she was given. Would these reactions continue for her as the weeks and months went on? Yes, as there was a general sense by now that Chelsea Green had something going on and that WWE needed to capitalize on it. And that would eventually happen for her in November of 2024, as this was the point that WWE announced they were going to be introducing main roster women's mid-card titles, namely a women's Intercontinental title for Raw and a women's United States Championship for SmackDown. So with Chelsea being a part of the Blue Brands roster again by this point, her next steps seemed clear: become the inaugural Women's United States Champion. Of course, at that point, many fans assumed the first champion would be someone like Bayley or Bianca Belair, but to the surprise of those fans, it would actually be Chelsea Green who ultimately held this title around her waist at Saturday night's main event on December 14th, after winning a tournament which saw her beat not only both of those women, but also Blair Davenport and Michin too. Yes, after all this time, the British Columbian was a singles champion again. And now she was a singles champion on the big stage of WWE. Where will she go from here? Well, the sky's the limit, because with a whole new year ahead of her and gold around her waist once more, she's never felt more important. Maybe she'll go on a lengthy reign with this new mid-card belt now, helping to establish it as an important one in the company's hierarchy. Or maybe her time with it will be short, and once it's done, she'll move on to bigger fish like the world title. Whatever she does, we're sure it'll be interesting, because whether she's a Karen or not, Chelsea Green has now proven herself to be one of the great women's wrestlers of her generation. Often, when a wrestler who started out in WWE ends up getting cut from their contract, this marks the end of their career, as unwilling to rebuild themselves on the indies, they're rarely, if ever, heard from again. But that's not the case for everyone. No, some use the minor leagues as a place to have a fresh start, all en route towards heading back to the top. And a rare few, well, they make the minors their home and help to elevate this level of the industry with their sheer presence alone. And that's exactly what Matt Cardona has done. But how did he get to this point? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into his career journey so far in Always Ready, the Matt Cardona story. Matthew Brett Cardona was born in Merrick, New York on May 14, 1985, and it was there he went through some difficulties during childhood. As well, in high school, he'd be diagnosed with a rare illness called synovial sarcoma. Needless to say then, this must have been a scary time for young Matt, but thankfully he'd pull through and would enter remission, with this being a place he has remained right up until the present day. And it was also during his childhood that Matt would start his dream of one day becoming a professional wrestler. Yes, ever since a young age, Matt had always been a huge wrestling fan, and that was why it was in 2004 that upon graduating, he'd start training in the ways of the ring under former ECW World Champion Mikey Whipwreck. Would being trained by Whipwreck open some doors for Matt in the local New York scene? Yes, it would. In fact, only a few months after starting his training, the rookie would already be getting bookings at the New York Wrestling Connection, and it would be there he'd largely remain for the next couple of years as he slowly built a name for himself going by the ring name of Brett Matthews and teaming with Brian Myers in a series of tag team bouts. So much of a name would Matt build here, in fact, by the time his run there was over, both he and Brian would be two-time NYWC Tag Team Champions. But this would only be the beginning for the pair as it happened, because things were about to skyrocket to an all-new level for them when, in 2005, they found themselves being signed up to developmental contracts with WWE. That's right, after taking note of their work on the indies, WWE brought Cardona and Myers in, and after giving the former a cameo appearance on an episode of SmackDown where he jobbed out to Matt Morgan in short order, sent them down to Deep South Wrestling where they could learn the WWE style. Not that the Merrick native would be going by either his real name or the name of Brett Matthews in DSW, though. No, there he'd be rebranded as Brett Major, all while his partner would be renamed Brian Major. Ultimately, though, it didn't matter what moniker they were going by. No, all that mattered was how they were performing in the ring. And how they were performing was great, because pretty soon they'd have become DSW Tag Team Champions after beating the Untouchables for the honor. And that wasn't the only time the major players held the gold in Deep South either. In fact, like with their time in NYWC, they'd also become two-time champions in Georgia as well. Then, when DSW stopped being WWE's developmental system and Ohio Valley Wrestling became the place to go for young rookies under contract to Vince McMahon instead, the major players would head over there and win their OVW Southern Tag Team Championships too. But of course, all of this was just table setting for what was to come, as in 2007, 2 years after signing their WWE contracts, the pair would finally get that main roster call-up, and they'd get it in a big way. What was so big about this particular call-up? Well, it involved Matt and Brian, now going by the names of Zack Ryder and Curt Hawkins, being put into Edge's heel stable La Familia. That's right, in their first order of business on SmackDown, the two up-and-comers would be placed right into a main event program, and with one of Matt's favorite wrestlers, no less. Obviously then, this was a dream come true for the New Yorker, as it saw him get a perfect opportunity to sit under the learning tree of a legend like Edge. And while this was all happening off-screen, on-screen, Ryder and Hawkins would prove to be a regular thorn in the side of any opponents the Rated R superstar was going up against that month, as with them being kayfabe acquaintances of Edge's kayfabe wife, they had all the motivation they needed to help keep the World Heavyweight title around his waist. But it wasn't all just about keeping the title on the leader of the group. No, the Rated R Entourage, as they would come to be known by commentary for a while, also had their sights set upon winning gold of their own. And that soon led them to going after then WWE Tag Team Champions John Morrison and The Miz. Sure, they weren't the only ones going after these belts. No, Jesse and Festus and Finlay and Hornswoggle were also in the chase, but in the end, neither of these teams would be the one to stand tall by the time all was said and done, and a fatal four-way bout between each of the pairings hit the ring at July 20th, 2008's Great American Bash. No, the team who would come out on top here would be none other than the Rated R Entourage, with this giving them yet another set of tag team gold to add to their trophy case. Of course, this was different from any gold they'd won before, though. This was main roster WWE gold. And now the champions, Ryder and Hawkins, would go on to defend this as if it was the most precious thing in their lives. That said, as with all good things, their run on top couldn't last forever. No, it was on the September 26th episode of SmackDown that the pair would drop the titles to the Colognes. And as if that wasn't bad enough, by then La Familia had begun to fall apart too, leading to the Rated R Entourage suddenly not having a family around them anymore. Still, at least they had each other, right? Well, not anymore, because during the 2009 draft, Zack and Curt would be split up, with the former at this point being sent down to WWECW. But while this could have been bad for him, in the end it was the best thing that ever happened for the Merrick boy, as it was here that he was able to let his creativity fly and come up with a character which would truly get him over. What was this character? Well, it was that of the Long Island loudmouth, a brash Jersey boy who looked like he'd stepped straight off the set of Jersey Shore. Needless to say then, this made him an instant heel in fans' eyes, but even if he was being roundly booed every time he bust out one of his trademark quotes like "woo woo woo, you know it," this didn't matter to Zack Ryder. No, all that mattered to him was that for the first time in his career, he was truly over on a big stage. How little did he know then that this was only the beginning? Yes, things were going to get much bigger for the New Yorker soon enough, way bigger than anyone could ever have imagined. Before that happened though, he'd continue to work his way up the card on WWE ECW by putting on strong showings against the likes of Finlay, Christian, and ECW original Tommy Dreamer. Hell, he'd actually be the one who'd get kayfabe credit for forcing the Innovator of Violence to exit the formerly Extreme brand once and for all in December of that year. Truly a heel move if we ever saw one. And all this meant that once WWE ECW was canceled in February of 2010 and many on the roster there were worried about whether or not they'd still have a job going forward, Zack had no reason to feel any concern, because as one of the bright spots there during its dying days, it would be a no-brainer he'd be brought back up to the main roster proper at this point, albeit this time on Raw instead of SmackDown. That's right, now a Red Brand regular, Ryder would get back to work on starting his own revolution when he found a new valet in Alicia Fox. Unfortunately for him, though, this association with Fox proved to be short-lived, as in June of 2010, mere weeks after his call-up to Monday nights, he would be turned on by Foxy. So that left him alone all over again and forced to regroup as his plans for domination of Raw went back to square one. But even if this was a low point for Zack, it wouldn't mean he'd remain at the bottom for long. No, by the time August came around, he'd be getting a chance to challenge Sheamus for the WWE title, albeit unsuccessfully, and by the time the autumn was dawning, he'd find himself in a position of authority when he became a mentor to Titus O'Neil on the second season of NXT, back when it was in its game show format. Sure, this might not have been where he wanted to be long term, but it was better than doing nothing, so Ryder made the most of the situation and did his best to impress his bosses every time he was on screen on NXT. In the end though, this didn't work out the way he'd hoped it would, because once NXT came to an end, the New Yorker would be relegated to working on Superstars for the rest of the year and well into the next. What he needed then was something to really shake things up for him, something which would prove he had a lot more to offer WWE outside of being a lower card act. So that was why he took to the internet. Yes, in one of the earliest examples of a wrestler making the internet work for them, Zack created a YouTube web series in 2011 named the Z True Long Island Story, where he would treat us all to the regular exploits of his character, as well as some of his real-life antics, such as toy collecting. And to a young audience who were fast making YouTube their main source of media, Zack Ryder found himself getting hugely over as something of a cult sensation. So over would he get, in fact, he'd even get his own belt for the channel, the Internet Championship. Not that this would lead to a push for him right away or anything. No, even though WWE did make Z True Long Island Story a part of their official YouTube channel, bookers in WWE still didn't want to make Long Island Ice Z a more focused upon character on television. Of course, fans disagreed with such an assessment, however, and that was how, over the course of the next year or so, the Ryder Revolution would gradually pick up steam on WWE TV as fans started to chant Zack's name during shows in what served as a precursor for the Yes Movement. Unlike with the Yes Movement, though, this revolution would not lead to Cardona making it all the way up to the top of the card in WWE. No, even when live crowds hijacked a segment featuring The Rock to let the company know they wanted more Ryder, WWE still didn't have plans for him to be placed at the top of the card. However, as time went on, Zack would get a more prominent spot on TV as the assistant general manager of SmackDown in July of 2011, and after this, he would gain even more success, as he would have a US title run which began when he beat Dolph Ziggler at TLC, Tables, Ladders, and Chairs, in December of that same year. Yes, this would be a huge moment for Ryder, as it proved that he could compete on the next level up on the card. Sadly though, this push wouldn't go on forever, as 2012 started out with Long Island Ice Z finding not only a new ally in John Cena, but also a new on-screen girlfriend in Eve Torres, only for things to dramatically fall to the point that by the time February rolled around, he'd have dropped his US title to Jack Swagger, would have to watch on as Cena and Eve made out in front of him, then would suffer the final indignance of being put into a wheelchair and rolled off of the entrance ramp by Kane. So bad did things get that many fans started to lose faith in the character of Zack Ryder, who had for a time been their hero. No, by now it was clear that the Ryder Revolution had ended. That said, the person the whole situation hurt the most remained Matt Cardona, because he was the one who had greatness within his grasp, only for it to be pulled away at the last minute. Still, even if this was the case, what else could he do but keep going on? So that's exactly what he did by doing whatever was asked of him going forward, whether this was having matches on Main Event or occasionally showing up on Raw to do jobs to more focused upon stars like Cody Rhodes and Antonio Cesaro. So bad did things get for Zack, in fact, that in 2013 he'd lose every single televised match he had on Raw and SmackDown. Hell, even when he did get put into a mini feud with an act like The Shield, he'd pretty much be cannon fodder at this time. And by the time it was over, he'd be right back to where he started, a step above an enhancement talent. And 2014 wouldn't go much better for him either. No, despite making one last attempt to get fans on his side again by starting a new YouTube series, Zack Ryder's Last Resort, all this led to was even less appearances on TV for him, as it became very clearly apparent WWE had no plans for the New Yorker. And after he tore his rotator cuff in November of that year, he'd return to the ring at the 2015 Royal Rumble, and there proceed to get eliminated in short order by Bray Wyatt. And by the time WrestleMania 31 came around, all he did was appear in the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal. Yes, he would get a brief boost when on the May 25th episode of Raw that year, he'd get to challenge John Cena for the United States title in his hometown. But that was only a fleeting moment, and once it was over, it would be right back to the bottom of the card again for Long Island Iced Z. Thank God things would finally start to turn around for him in June of 2015 then, as that was when he began teaming up with Mojo Rawley to create the Hype Bros. Sure, it wasn't exactly a main event act or anything, but it at least gave Ryder something to do for the first time in a long time. That said, most of what he would do at this point would be head down to NXT to put over the likes of The Revival, American Alpha, and Enzo and Big Cass, a far cry from where he'd been just a few years before. But it wouldn't be like this forever. No, while the time for Zack Ryder to be a true main event star in WWE had seemingly passed by now, he would still get his moment in the sun as, after returning to the main roster in early 2016, he'd find himself being inserted into a 7-man ladder match for the Intercontinental title at WrestleMania 32. And to the shock of everyone, despite his opponents that night including names like Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn, Dolph Ziggler, The Miz, Stardust, and Sin Cara, he'd be the one who came out of the evening the winner. Yes, after all those years of struggling, Zack Ryder was now the Intercontinental Champion. Not that this would be a long reign for him or anything though, rather it would be more of a metaphorical gold watch as the following night on Raw, he dropped the gold right back to The Miz again. But even if it was short, it was still a career highlight for him, and a sign that there was still something he had which people were willing to get behind should he be presented in the right way. It's just a shame then that WWE had no intention of presenting him as a top player going forward, as all he would do for the remainder of 2016 and well into 2017 would be put over bigger names such as Rusev, Sheamus, and The Big Show. And when he wasn't doing that, he'd continue to partner with Mojo Rawley in the tag team division, with the pair usually coming out on the losing end by the time all was said and done. And while this was happening on screen, behind the scenes, Matt's personal life was booming, as it was around here that he began dating then TNA star Chelsea Green. And as 2017 was drawing to a close, he and Mojo Rawley went their separate ways, as Zack wanted to start working as a singles act again. How would this go for him? Not great at first. No, the truth is, Ryder did nothing of real note during 2018. In fact, it wasn't until 2019 that things picked up for him once more, as it was in the early months of this year that he reunited with his old friend and partner, Curt Hawkins. And this all led to the pair getting their big moment on the WrestleMania 35 pre-show when they beat The Revival to not only end Hawkins' losing streak, but also win the Raw Tag Team titles. And after going on a 2-month reign with the belts, the duo would drop the belts back to The Revival on an episode of Raw later that year. And this would turn out to be the last thing of note that Ryder would do in WWE, as it was in April of 2020 he'd be part of a mass wave of releases from WWE, with this forcing him to make a decision about what he wanted to do with his future. Would he rest on his laurels and move over to the ex-WWE stars signs autographs at conventions phase of his career, or would he try to reinvent himself in a completely new environment? The latter, as it happened. Yes, following a couple of cameo appearances on Dynamite in the summer of that year where he came to the aid of his old buddy Cody Rhodes, the man now once more going by the name of Matt Cardona would rebuild himself from the ground up as the King of the Indies. Who was the King of the Indies exactly? Well, he was a guy who would travel to every corner of the globe to show just how talented he really is when given the opportunity to shine. And this new character would be presented as a heel, with the most nuclear levels of heat being saved for his appearances at Game Changer wrestling shows, the very place he first introduced a new spinner version of their world title after winning it from deathmatch legend Nick Gage at GCW Homecoming on July 24th, 2021. Of course, this wouldn't be the only place Matt Cardona would be appearing as the new decade fully got going. No, like any indie legend, he'd pop up anywhere and everywhere. Hell, his new gimmick of traveling belt collector would see him appear in places like DDT, MLW, NWA, and even TNA, with all of this leading to him at one point holding 9 separate titles at once. That said, most of this time would be spent working in the Impact Zone. With it being there, he not only locked horns with the likes of Ace Austin, W. Morrissey, and even Jordynne Grace, but where he got to work alongside Chelsea Green, the woman who had by now become his wife, in tag team action. In fact, so much fun would Matt have in TNA, he'd remain there all the way up until 2023, by which point he'd have become a one-time digital media champion. And all the while he was doing this, he was continuing to ply his craft elsewhere too, with it being around the same time that he also became a one-time NWA World's Champion in Billy Corgan's revamped version of the National Wrestling Alliance after he beat Trevor Murdoch for the honor. As time went on, though, the King of the Indies would have to start dropping the numerous titles he was collecting, and that meant doing so in bouts such as when he lost the GCW World Championship to Jon Moxley. Obviously, this match with Mox impressed somewhat at AEW then, because in recent months, Cardona has found himself returning to that ecosystem for a few one-shots when he not only appeared on the March 30th, 2024 episode of Collision to answer Adam Copeland's TNT Title Open Challenge, but also showed up in Ring of Honor to try, and ultimately failed, to win the ROH World Championship from Chris Jericho at Final Battle on December 20th of the same year. Does this mean we can expect to see him sign a contract with AEW soon? Possibly. Or maybe we see him join his wife Chelsea Green in WWE and finish his story, much like Cody Rhodes did. Either way, we know Matt Cardona will make whatever he does a success, as he's proven now for the past 20 years, he's always ready to make the most out of any situation.
When it comes to in-ring skill, there are few, if any, who are better than Bret Hart. During his career, he managed to build a name for himself as the absolute pinnacle when it came to technique, psychology, and storytelling. So much so that even today, many consider him to be the greatest of all time. So join us today as we take a deep dive into his entire career journey in Excellence of Execution, the Bret Hart Story. Bret Sergeant Hart was born on July 2, 1957 in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, into the legendary Hart family. The Hart clan, of course, was led by Stu, an icon in the Canadian scene and the promoter of Stampede Wrestling for many years by that point. It was expected then that all of his male heirs would enter the business too, and so along with his 7 other brothers, Bret was enveloped into the wrestling industry from a very young age. Of course, stories of them all being trained in the Hart family dungeon, getting stretched out and put through the ringer have entered into industry myth over the years. In fact, so hardcore was much of this training that many of the Hart brothers would also become accomplished amateur wrestlers too. The future Hitman would even find some success with this during his younger years as well, as he went on to win several championships around various Alberta-based tournaments, and at one point even looked like he could become an Olympic hopeful. That said, however, he would always keep his eyes set on the world of the pros, as that's where he really wanted to be in the long run. And this began for him in 1976 when he started making appearances for Stampede Wrestling, initially refereeing matches, but quickly putting on his boots and fighting for himself. Initially, he partnered with his brother Keith as the two went on to win the Stampede International Tag Team Championships 4 times together. Despite this though, it was clear that Bret had a lot of potential as a singles competitor, and so he would go out on his own before long, eventually winning the British Commonwealth Mid-Heavyweight Championship twice and North American Heavyweight Championship 6 times. With all this talent then, word of him soon spread around the industry, and it became only a matter of time before Vince McMahon, who Stu had a working relationship with at that time, would come calling and try and get Bret onto his roster. And eventually this happened in 1984 when McMahon brought the young Canadian in, initially hoping to give him a cowboy gimmick until the future WWE champion vetoed this, stating instead that he just wanted to wrestle as himself. And himself was all he needed to be, as it turned out, because very quickly the Hitman, as he had then come to be known, would endear himself to fans as an occasional singles performer and regular tag partner of his real-life brother-in-law Jim Neidhart, the two naming themselves the Hart Foundation. It was also around this time that commentator Gorilla Monsoon christened Bret with the moniker The Excellence of Execution on account of his unparalleled skill in the ring, which, even at this point, was noticeable. And his skills would only get better as time went on, as he got to work with some of the greatest wrestlers in the world now that he was in WWE. He even shared the ring with Andre the Giant in the WrestleMania 2 Battle Royal in a fact that sounds like it should be made up, but isn't. By February 7, 1987, the Hart Foundation were also able to win Tag Team Gold for the first time when they beat the British Bulldogs on an episode of Superstars of Wrestling, and not long after this, they would officially turn babyface for the first time in WWE. Following that, they would lose the tag titles, but Bret was able to bounce back by having his most high-profile match to date when he took on Macho Man Randy Savage on the November 28th episode of Saturday Night's Main Event. Yes, clearly the company could see that they had something special in the Hitman, and they showed this even more when they had him be the first entrant into the inaugural Royal Rumble, lasting a full 25 minutes and 42 seconds before getting eliminated. And this upward momentum only continued as he got a shot at the Honky Tonk Man's Intercontinental title that July, a shot he would be unable to win at the time, but one which would set the stage for where he was going in the future. From there, between 1988 and 1991, Bret would continue to get chances to shine in singles competition, all while the Hart Foundation dominated the tag team division, getting big wins over the likes of the Rougeaus, Rhythm and Blues, and Demolition, the latter of whom they would defeat to win the tag team titles for the second time. By SummerSlam of 1991, though, it was impossible to ignore the fact that Bret was ready to be a full-time singles star. And so, after he and Neidhart had disbanded their team a few months prior, the Hitman challenged Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental Championship at the big summer event, making him tap out to his finisher, the Sharpshooter, after 18 minutes to begin his first reign with the gold. It should come as no surprise then that by that September, he would also win the King of the Ring tournament, an event that was at this time still untelevised, but from there continued to defend the IC title in what was often the best match of the show, fully living up to the legacy set by past champions like Randy Savage and Ricky Steamboat. In January of 1992, he would lose the belt to the Mountie, but this, as it turned out, was only done to set up a big passing of the torch moment between Bret and Rowdy Roddy Piper at WrestleMania 8, as Piper, who in the intervening time had won the Intercontinental strap from the Mountie, did the honors for Hart at the grandest stage of them all, putting him over strong as the two gave audiences one of the best examples of in-ring storytelling the company had ever seen by this point. After that, Bret defended his newly re-won title against Shawn Michaels in WWE's first ever ladder match, a match which had been popular in Stampede Wrestling and one which the Canadian had been trying to get WWE to use for some time. And of course, this match would also be memorable for being the start of the feud that in many ways defined Hart's career, his continued beef with the Heartbreak Kid. This would remain on the back burner for now though, because he had bigger things on his plate as he was set to take on his brother-in-law, the British Bulldog, at SummerSlam 1992, a WWE pay-per-view which, for the first time ever, was being held at Wembley Stadium in London, England. And on that night, in front of what was, at the time, WWE's largest crowd ever, Hart and the Bulldog main evented and absolutely stole the show, putting on a match that many to this day consider to be one of the greatest they've ever seen. Yes, by this point, everyone could see that not only was Bret Hart a fantastic wrestler, but he was arguably the best in the whole world. And so after Hulk Hogan had left the company earlier that year, Vince McMahon, needing a new face to carry things, decided to give the Canadian an opportunity, having him pin Ric Flair to win the WWE title for the first time at a Superstars taping in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan on October 12th of 1992. This was a major moment, of course, because it represented a change in the boss's philosophy, with him choosing not to put the belt on an overly muscular guy, but instead on a relatively small but supremely talented performer like Hart. Now, part of the reason for this was the ongoing steroid trial, but nevertheless, Bret took the opportunity and ran with it, quickly establishing himself as a worthy face in the company as he became a fighting champion, defending against the likes of Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon before losing the belt to Yokozuna at WrestleMania 9. Of course, anyone who remembers that show will know that it was the one where Hulk Hogan made his return and appeared after the main event to beat Yoko in an impromptu match, winning the WWE title for the 5th time. Allegedly, this was supposed to lead to Hogan passing the torch to Bret as the new face of the company at the subsequent SummerSlam pay-per-view. However, Hogan apparently nixed this before it could happen, claiming Hart wasn't in his league and refusing to put him over. Now, this has never been confirmed by the Hulkster himself, but given his history, we're inclined to believe it happened, and so instead, Bret had to settle for winning the 1993 King of the Ring, the first one that was televised, as he went through the ringer in the one-night tournament, putting on 3 excellent and very different performances against Razor Ramon, Mr. Perfect, and Bam Bam Bigelow, once again proving just how skilled he was in the ring. After that, he started up a long-term feud with Jerry the King Lawler, something that would continue on throughout 1993, and would even branch across to Lawler's own federation, the United States Wrestling Association. And it was here that Bret's younger brother Owen first came into the main event picture too, as he joined forces with the Hitman during his battles with the King. This would lead to the two teaming up more long-term as the brothers began setting their sights on winning tag team gold together. And eventually, after a series of victories, they would get this chance when they took on the Quebecers at the 1994 Royal Rumble, ultimately losing after an injured Bret refused to tag out and the referee was forced to call for a stoppage. This of course angered Owen, so much so that he turned on his brother after the match, kicking his leg out of his leg and starting a feud between the two that would build in intensity over the next couple of months. But that wasn't the end of the night for Bret, because despite his kayfabe injury, he would return to enter the Royal Rumble match later on and would even become the joint winner alongside Lex Luger after both men eliminated each other at the same time. This then set up 2 major programs for the Hitman at WrestleMania 10, one personal as he was set to take on his brother, and the other business as both he and Luger would get individual shots at Yokozuna and the WWE title. That night on March 20th, 1994, the Hart brothers would kick things off by having one of the best pure wrestling matches ever seen either inside or outside of a WWE ring. To the shock of many though, it would be Owen who would get the surprise win in the end, something which made far more sense by the time the event was over. After that, Bret had one more mountain to climb as he challenged Yokozuna for the WWE title in the main event, eventually beating him to regain his belt as the locker room of babyfaces came out to the ring and hoisted him up on their shoulders while a rapturous Madison Square Garden crowd cheered him on. There was one person who didn't take part in that celebration though, because Owen could be seen stood in the entranceway, watching his brother and knowing that he had pinned him and, as such, was next in line for that title. That match would come at August 29, 1994's SummerSlam, as the Hart family feud reached its peak when the two brothers faced off inside a steel cage while their entire family watched from ringside. Unfortunately though, despite giving him the belt, it seems WWE never felt comfortable fully pushing him as their face, as he rarely got a chance to main event during this title run, often playing second fiddle to the likes of The Undertaker. When he eventually lost the belt to Bob Backlund at that November Survivor Series then, many feared that the company had lost faith in him as a draw and would begin easing him back down the card. Sadly, this is what happened, sort of. While he was still pushed as a big star, Bret would spend the vast majority of 1995 being stuck in middling mid-card feuds with the likes of Jean-Pierre Lafitte and Isaac Yankem, as Vince McMahon's attention was diverted towards his new favorite toy, Diesel. It wouldn't be until November Survivor Series, in fact, that Vince finally realized fans didn't want Diesel but wanted the Hitman instead, and so he put the belt back on him. After that, Hart carried the title into the new year, but even at this point, McMahon already had one eye on his next big thing as he was preparing to have his champion face Shawn Michaels at the upcoming WrestleMania 12. This match would end up being the now iconic Iron Man match, one which, depending on who you ask, might be either the best or the most overrated WrestleMania match ever. Either way, it's undeniable that both men would put on an incredible athletic performance that night as they went for a full hour without anyone being able to score a single fall. It would take a sudden death overtime, in fact, for a winner to finally be decided, something that would happen when HBK was able to hit his opponent with 2 super kicks to realize his boyhood dream of becoming WWE Champion. After that, the plan was for Bret to take some time off and try his hand out at acting as, burnt out with WWE's brutal road schedule, he had gotten himself a role in the TV series Lonesome Dove, and had hoped that this might serve as a nice way of recharging his batteries once again. During this time, however, the on-screen heat between Bret and Shawn Michaels began to spill over into real life, as Bret allegedly felt disrespected by HBK's calls for him to get out of his ring after their match, something which would only simmer in the months that followed. But regardless of that, by November of 1996, Hart was now feeling charged up again and ready to return to the ring. At this point, though, he almost ended up moving over to WCW instead after they had presented him with a very lucrative contract. Bret, loyal to Vince, however, decided to stick with WWE and was rewarded for this by being given a 20-year, multi-million-dollar contract. But when he did return to a WWE ring, he quickly found that things had changed and that the days of his paragon of virtue babyface antics were becoming passé. This was emphasized further as he got into a feud with Stone Cold Steve Austin, the two facing off at the 1996 Survivor Series and then continuing to beef well into the new year as fans started to turn on the Hitman and embrace the villainous Rattlesnake more and more. This led to them having a final showdown at WrestleMania 13, a match which we've talked about in detail over on our Steve Austin video, but to put it lightly, is probably the greatest wrestling match ever. And it was on that night that Hart finally turned heel, at least to American fans. Yes, this was the beginning of a truly unique story where the Hitman remained babyface in his home country of Canada while being a heel south of the border, starting off something of a company war between the two nations where, depending on the country any given show was taking place in, the heel-face dynamic would switch. And this was never more apparent than at the July 6, 1997 Canadian Stampede show where, in front of their own countrymen, the newly reformed Hart Foundation, which by then included Bret, Owen, the British Bulldog, Jim Neidhart, and Brian Pillman, came out to one of the loudest ovations you're ever likely to hear. Of course, while this story was one of the best things going in WWE during 1997, it hadn't always been the plan, as Hart was initially supposed to get his rematch with Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 13, with HBK returning the favor from the year prior and putting him over. Michaels, however, notorious for his prima donna attitude at this time, allegedly refused to lose to Bret and instead vacated the belt after suffering a knee injury which many, the Hitman included, believed to be faked or at least embellished so that he didn't have to lose it in the ring. By now, the real-life heat between these two men had grown so severe that later that year, they even got involved in a real fistfight backstage and had to be separated as Vince McMahon desperately tried to get his performers under control. And this certainly wasn't helped when Shawn would do things like throw accusations of the Hitman cheating on his wife out on live TV. Eventually, though, things were able to get calmed down enough to the point where they could book a match between them at the 1997 Survivor Series. However, by this point, there was an even bigger problem at play. Again, as we've said in our Shawn Michaels video, the Montreal Screwjob could fill up an entire video in itself, but for reference here, the basic notes are that Vince could no longer pay for Bret's 20-year contract given the company's financial woes at the time, and so gave him permission to negotiate with WCW. What he'd forgotten to do before that, however, was to take the title off of him, and so now his contract was running out, and he realized he had to have Hart visually lose on TV, otherwise risk him going to the competition as the champion in the fans' eyes. The initial solution was that Bret was booked to lose to Shawn that night at the Survivor Series, but given the heat between the two men, the Hitman refused. This leading to McMahon and a select few others scheming to have it look like he had tapped out towards the end of the match, even though he hadn't, taking the belt from him in a moment that left Hart feeling hugely disrespected given his years of loyalty to the company. Furious then, after he realized what had happened to him, he trashed the ringside area and went on to punch Vince backstage, leaving him with a black eye, much of which was captured in the documentary Wrestling with Shadows, which, coincidentally, was being filmed at this time. After that, he vowed to never have anything to do with WWE again as he jumped ship to Ted Turner's Southern Wrestling promotion. Unfortunately, though, it would quickly become apparent that WCW had no idea what to do with their newest acquisition, and so after a completely botched first couple of years there which saw him do little of note, he would eventually win the WCW title on December 7, 1999, only to vacate it a couple of weeks later after a botched superkick from Bill Goldberg left him with a severe concussion. After that, rather than giving him time to fully recover, WCW put him back into the ring in a hardcore match with Terry Funk, with him suffering another concussion there, this finally being the one to end his career as he would develop post-concussion syndrome soon thereafter. And so, just like that, the storied in-ring career of Bret "Hitman" Hart had come to an end. Sadly, in the years that followed, things would get even worse as the Hart family were torn apart with infighting after the tragic death of Owen in a stunt gone wrong at 1999's WWE Over the Edge pay-per-view. 2 years after that, and Bret would also suffer a stroke, leaving him temporarily in a wheelchair. Thankfully though, time heals all wounds, and as the years progressed, his health improved, and he finally mended fences with WWE following the events of both the Montreal Screwjob and the death of his brother. In 2006, he was even inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, and in 2009, he would bury the hatchet with Shawn Michaels after the two had a memorable in-ring segment together on an episode of Raw. Following this, he got a chance to close the door on Montreal forever as he and Vince McMahon had a match together at WrestleMania 26, one which, given the incredibly limited nature of what Hart could do by that point, unfortunately ended up stinking out the joint but nevertheless allowed the Hitman to finally put things behind him. Since then, he's made occasional appearances on WWE TV, at one point even briefly winning the United States title from The Miz. As well as that, he served as temporary manager for his niece Natalya while she was in NXT, and in 2019 became a two-time Hall of Famer after both he and Jim Neidhart were inducted for their tag team efforts as the Hart Foundation. Yes, thankfully it looks like the Hitman can now be at peace with how things ended during his career and instead look back across the many high points he had, because, as we said at the start of this video, there are few, if any, who could match up to him in the ring. Just watch pretty much any of his matches, because each one remains a master class in how to be the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be.